Well, good morning. I'm going to call the subcommittee to order, and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. And again, good morning and welcome to today's hearing. Almost 3 years have passed since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, became law. This legislation appropriated $42.5 billion to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, BEAD program at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, to deploy broadband infrastructure to unserved and underserved homes and businesses. While this investment in broadband infrastructure to rural communities is a worthy cause, I'm concerned with the implementation of the BEAD program. I'm going to start the timer. First, this program was created outside of the regular order and therefore lacks appropriate provisions to safeguard these taxpayer dollars. There was no discussion of whether $42 billion is the right amount to connect every American or debate on how this program should be administered. The infrastructure bill was also missed an opportunity to enact meaningful permitting reform that would have broken down barriers to deployment and stretched this federal funding further. I'm further concerned with how the Biden administration is running the program. NTIA continues to add requirements that are contrary to congressional intent and make this program less attractive and more expensive to the broadband providers needed to deploy to unserved and underserved communities. These actions include adopting price controls for certain broadband plans, preferring certain technologies over others, and adding burdensome and unnecessary workforce and climate requirements. We've raised these concerns with the NTIA at numerous oversight hearings and in letters to the agency. I fear that these burdensome requirements are delaying approval of the state initial proposals and will jeopardize the success of the grant program. I'm also concerned about impending workforce and supply chain shortages. Getting the workers, bucket trucks, and other materials needed to deploy broadband will be challenging with 56 states and territories chasing the same supply chain and workforce at the same time. This will lead to shortages and higher prices that will eat up money and time needed for deployment, undermining the success of this program. Fortunately, NTIA has listened to some of our feedback. 2 weeks ago, NTIA sought comment on how states can use alternative technologies such as unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit LEO satellites to serve our most remote areas. Although these technologies should have been permitted from the start, I'm pleased that NTIA has finally realized that it will take all available technologies to bridge the digital divide. I hope that NTIA makes similar changes to address the other concerns we have raised. Before I conclude, I want to mention the Universal Service Fund Working Group and efforts to revive the Affordable Connectivity Program, the ACP. As I know my colleagues on this side will likely raise it. I am committed to finding a long-term solution to address broadband affordability. However, ACP must be reformed to ensure that it is targeted toward those who truly need the subsidy to pay for broadband. It must have a sustainable funding source. Relying solely on stopgap funding leads to uncertainty for those who rely on the program. I'm actively working on a solution with my colleagues and a bipartisan bicameral Universal Service Fund Working Group, along with the ranking member of this subcommittee. Time is running short for this Congress, but I hope we can reach an agreement on this important issue. Closing the digital divide is a bipartisan priority, and significant federal resources have been dedicated to this effort. Today's hearing is an opportunity to discuss the NTIA's administration of the BEAD program from the perspective of those on the ground, the states and broadband providers that will do the work of deploying broadband for our unserved and underserved communities. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I thank them for appearing before us today. And at this time, I'll now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from California's 7th District, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing focuses on a program we should all want to succeed. The BEAD program represents our best shot at connecting every American to affordable, high-quality broadband. This is a tremendous task, requiring thoughtful planning and coordination between our federal agencies and states. Thanks to the hard work of NTIA and our state and local governments, BEAD achieved substantial milestones this year. NTIA is laying the groundwork to ensure this historic $42 billion investment is deployed responsibly to expand high-speed internet access, consistent with the multi-year process established by Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure law. First, NTIA successfully approved every state's Volume 1 initial proposals. This allows each state to launch a review process to confirm whether a location has high-speed broadband, ensuring that BEAD dollars go where they're most needed. To date, NTIA also has approved over 40 states' Volume 2 initial proposals. This is a critical step for states to begin selecting the broadband projects that will receive funding. Additionally, NTIA has obligated more than $20 billion in BEAD funding to states and territories for planning and execution. To further set up BEAD for success, NTIA has actively engaged with public feedback, and just last month, the agency welcomed input on its proposed guidance for choosing the right mix of technologies to connect even the most remote areas. All this is to say, BEAD is on track. NTIA is implementing this program within the timeline set under law and with the care and deliberation necessary to ensure that BEAD can connect the tens of millions of Americans who still lack affordable broadband. We all want the program to move quickly and get people connected. But when the stakes are this high, we need to measure twice and cut once, or we may fail and waste billions of dollars. What's more, we must remember that BEAD is not just about building out infrastructure. It's about securing affordable, accessible broadband for all. That's why Congress required state BEAD plans to include a low-cost option, and why Ranking Member Pallone and I, along with every Democrat on this subcommittee, sent a letter earlier this year supporting NTIA prioritizing affordability as it reviews state plans. Almost two-thirds of Californians without home broadband say cost is a key reason. In my district, I hear about the need for broadband affordability, whether I'm in downtown Sacramento or in our farming communities down in the Delta. Similarly, we have the opportunity today to hear from Montana Broadband Office, whose state survey found that affordability was the second most cited reason why people went without high-speed internet. Affordability and accessibility go hand in hand when closing the digital divide and ensuring BEAD's success. And the high cost of broadband affects all Americans. That's why I'm glad that NTIA is working to ensure that state BEAD plans have robust affordability measures tailored to local needs. This work has only grown in urgency with a lapse in funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program. To truly meet BEAD's goal of connecting every and underserved American with high-speed internet, Congress must restore ACP. ACP would build a reliable customer base for providers as they harness BEAD funding to deploy to our hardest-to-reach areas. Democrats remain labor-focused on extending ACP funding to restore low-cost broadband to millions of impacted families. I urge my colleagues from across the aisle to work with us to bring back this vital program. And with that, I once again thank the witnesses for appearing before us today and look forward to this discussion. And I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Washington, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Latta. Broadband connectivity is critical to our everyday life and winning the future. It's what connects our work, schools, businesses, hospitals, and more. Broadband helps create opportunity to spur growth, learn, and foster relationships, an opportunity that many rural Americans have lacked for far too long. Today's hearing is part of the Energy and Commerce Committee's continued efforts to close the digital divide through the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD. In this Congress alone, we've heard from NTIA Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson 3 times. Advanced major legislation that would address barriers to broadband permitting, and recently opened an investigation into NTIA's lack of transparency and unlawful actions in implementing the BEAD program. Republicans on this committee have been vocal about our concern that NTIA's self-imposed guidelines for BEAD will undermine the program's success, leading to wasted tax dollars while leaving Americans without the broadband access they need to succeed in their everyday life. Unfortunately, NTIA has only furthered our concerns by taking actions that will lead to increased cost and longer timelines for broadband deployment. NTIA's decision to pressure states to regulate the rates charged for broadband service, despite the law strictly prohibiting rate regulation, will make this program less attractive to the providers needed to participate for BEAD's success. NTIA is also using the program to push a radical agenda with unnecessary workforce and climate-related requirements, which will make this program more expensive to operate, diverting important dollars that should be used to connect more Americans. NTIA has spent 2 years pushing an expensive fiber-first agenda, violating the law's requirement to use a technology-neutral approach and making deployment cost-prohibitive in many unserved communities, especially in areas like those in parts of my district in eastern Washington. NTIA, to its credit, seems to finally be showing an openness to alternative technologies like unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellites, something that Republicans have been asking for since this program began. But by failing to do so, from the beginning, they've wasted time and money, which only results in fewer Americans getting connected. While the statute laid out certain timing requirements for the BEAD program, I continue to hear about unnecessary delays in NTIA's approval process. Burdensome red tape that NTIA added to the program has made compliance by states much more difficult. It's been nearly 14 months since states received their initial allocations from NTIA. Yet the administration still has not approved 16 initial state proposals. Vice President Harris was tasked by President Biden to be the broadband czar, which has resulted in little progress and heavy-handed federal bureaucracy. It's part of the reason we're having today's hearing, to hear from those on the ground, the states, the providers, and understand how Congress can ensure this program achieves its goal of connecting every American. Today is the first time we've had representatives from states and providers, those who will actually make the goals of BEAD a reality before this committee since the program was created. And I'm excited to hear from our witnesses about their experience so far and to discuss what still needs to be done to ensure we are successful in achieving our mission. Everyone here today wants BEAD to be successful, which is why congressional oversight of this program is critical. Our mission remains that every American be connected, and we're going to stay vigilant in fulfilling the commitment to the American people. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For years, Democrats and Republicans on this committee have talked about bringing high-speed internet to every community in the nation. And last Congress, Democrats delivered on that promise by passing the bipartisan infrastructure law that invested $65 billion in broadband, including $42 billion for the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, or BEAD program. The Biden-Harris administration has done more to advance our bipartisan goal of universal connectivity than any administration in memory. And the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, has risen to the occasion not only to execute a large and prescriptive broadband program, but also to restore and rehabilitate an agency that was left to wither in the Trump administration. So this hearing today is important. We should be examining the implementation of the BEAD program, which is going to make a huge difference in communities that have simply been left behind for far too long. The BEAD program is wildly popular amongst Democrats and Republicans and in blue and red states. We've seen enthusiastic public statements about the program from Republican governors like Governors Holcomb of Indiana, Lee of Tennessee, Cox of Utah, and our former committee colleague, Governor Gianforte of Montana. So I'd like to submit these statements from these governors for the record. And those are Republican voices outside of Washington, but unfortunately today, we're likely to hear committee Republicans criticize the implementation of the BEAD program, but we cannot and should not forget that every Republican member of this subcommittee voted against the infrastructure bill and the investments it has already started bringing to their states. They will likely complain that the investments are not getting to their states fast enough, but they all voted against the investments in the first place. So if committee Republicans had their way last Congress, these investments would have never become law and would not now be available to their states. And so today, they're going to focus their attention on a low-cost service option that helps to make internet more affordable for American families. They're going to deceptively call this low-cost option rate regulation, which it is not. The law directs NTIA to execute a deliberate process with the states and gives NTIA explicit authority to approve or disapprove what each state proposes for its low-cost option. Committee Republicans should not forget that this requirement was enacted on a bipartisan basis and not just created out of thin air by NTIA. And Congress included this requirement because having access to internet service is only meaningful if people can actually afford it. So we're also likely to hear that it's taking too long to start work on the projects being funded. We all want these networks deployed as soon as possible, but the process and timeline is exactly what the law requires and what is needed to get the job done right. And we do not want a repeat of the Republican FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program, which was rushed in 2020 to try and give then-President Trump a favorable talking point on the campaign trail. From the start, it was burdened by waste and plagued by providers defaulting on their commitments to build out networks. This program gave us an invaluable lesson in how not to design a broadband program. As of today, 48 states and territories have had their BEAD program plans approved by NTIA, including my home state of New Jersey, which had its $263 million plan approved last Friday. And Democrats in Congress and the Biden-Harris administration will not lose sight of our goal to connect every American to high-speed, reliable, and affordable internet. And that will not be the case if President Trump wins in November. The Trump Project 2025 calls for reevaluating the BEAD program to, quote, set fresh priorities. Anyone concerned about how quickly these projects will start connecting Americans should be extremely worried about the delays that this would cause. If we consider what Republicans might impose as fresh priorities for BEAD, we can look to ideas they volunteered over the past 2 years. This included gutting the low-cost option and expanding the use of less reliable and soon-to-be obsolete technology so that consumers' bills go up. We also can't forget that the Republicans opposed the extension of funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program, which served as a lifeline for more than 23 million households in this country until funding ran out in June. So as we discuss ensuring that all Americans have access to high-speed internet, we must continue to fight to make sure that that service is affordable for all American families. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back, and that will conclude the opening statements. Again, the subcommittee wants to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today to testify. Our witnesses will have 5 minutes to provide an opening statement, which will be followed by a round of questions from our members. The witnesses here before us today are Misty Ann Giles, the Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Montana Department of Administration; Basil Alwyn, Chief Executive Officer, Terrana Wireless; Shirley Bloomfield, Chief Executive Officer, NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association; and Blair Levin, the Policy Analyst, New Street Research, Non-Resident Fellow, Metropolitan Policy Project, the Brookings Institution. Again, I want to thank you all, and also I'd like to note for our witnesses that the timer lights on the table will turn yellow when the 1 minute you have 1 minute remaining. It will turn red when your time has expired. So when that happens, if you could wrap up, we'd appreciate it. And I can see today that the lights are working. There was one day we couldn't figure out why the testimony was going on longer because the lights weren't working. But I can see today they are. So, Ms. Giles, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chair Latta, Chair Rodgers, Ranking Member Matsui, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, I first want to thank you for the invitation today to speak to you from the state's perspective of the BEAD implementation efforts. My name is Misty Ann Giles, and I'm the Director of Administration and Chief Operating Officer for the state of Montana. Prior to joining Governor Greg Gianforte's administration, I served under former Governor Sonny Perdue and Nathan Deal of the state of Georgia, as well as served as Chief of Staff of USDA's Rural Development. My roles were always a little bit different, but a common theme was always the deployment of federal funding, including the 2018 efforts to stand up USDA's Reconnect program. In 2021, Governor Gianforte prioritized broadband for the state of Montana by first creating our office, first in its kind, and also allocating $310 million in ARPA dollars for deployment efforts. We were able to connect 62,000 new connections, as well as kind of put us a pace ahead for the BEAD efforts that were coming down the pike. Montana is obviously proud to be first in the nation to have our BEAD portal open for business. However, I would be remiss to say that that success has not come without a lot of difficulty over the last couple years. I do want to applaud NTIA for their efforts and their dedication to this program, but I think today's hearing is important to hear from the state's perspective of the challenges we face at the state level, both past and present. I think we all recognize that BEAD is a historic and generational investment to rural broadband. But I think the challenge that we face is when you're looking at deployment, a one-size-fits-all approach simply does not work. States all face the same common issue when it comes to BEAD deployment. It's navigating the complex BEAD process. It's really more akin to flying a plane while building it, yet we don't really have access to the full instruction set. We lack guidance at times, lack clear guidance. Guidance is given too late or it's conflicting. And this causes a pressure on us when it comes to our costs and our operations at the state level. And it's kind of creating a chaotic implementation environment, if you will. Further, social policies are prioritized, and this is creating more hoops and hurdles for both states and telecommunication providers alike to implement that are charged with deploying these funds. The Big Sky State is known for its epic beauty in reality, but also our harsh winters, as we're home to both the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, and this great beauty does come at a distinct cost when it comes to broadband deployment. We received a $628 million allocation for our BEAD efforts. However, FCC data shows that we need close to $1 billion to reach with all of our unserved and underserved locations with fiber. Just 10% of our locations will cost 72% of our total allocation, with the last 1% costing 25% of our allocation. That's how expensive deployment is in our state. You add a 4-year timeline, most of which the western states we will not be able to achieve due to our harsh winters. This is going to be a lot for us to get done. And these challenges so far have been met with lack of clarity, lack of timely guidance, and we're just trying to work through it to ensure we're all successful. A couple of examples I do want to focus on is first and foremost during the challenge process. As we know, this is all critical to ensure we're good stewards of taxpayer dollars and we don't overbuild. Several rounds of guidance was issued, states received approval, and new guidance came out. We had to manually implement those processes in my home state to be able to get the job done. Similarly with alternative technologies, it's great that we finally have guidance, but it's at the 11th hour for all states. Our initial proposals were due last December, and so we've got to figure out how to weave those in and implement. And some of us, like Montana, actually have our application window actually open for business. Permitting is another thing I know this committee has really been focused on. The guidance is minimal to lackluster, and right now we're required to use an NTIA screening platform. That's not even going to be available for another 6 to 8 months to states. Meanwhile, the 1-year shot clock for the final proposal has already started. So in short, it's been 3 years, and we're moving slower and not faster with timelines ticking for most states. NTIA, I do recognize, has a really challenging job of having all states swimming in the exact same swim lane at the exact same time trying to get this done. However, these are real problems and challenges that we face at the state level, and these need to be rectified. So not just Montana, but all states are successful in deploying these funds. So with that, I look forward to today's conversation and questions, and we'll stand for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Alwan. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chair McMorris, Rodgers, Subcommittee Chair Lata, Ranking Member Pallone, and Ranking Subcommittee Member Matsui, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Basil Alwan. I'm CEO of Toronto Wireless. It's an honor to appear before leaders that are all committed to, from diverse parts of our country and committed to solving the digital divide, sharing that common purpose for every American and providing high. Yeah, for sure, definitely. I think it's on. Is it good? Yeah, thank you. Very good. That's the mission of Toronto Wireless, a next-generation fixed wireless access technology company, both founded and headquartered in the U.S. I don't presume everyone here knows about Toronto Wireless, so I'll weave some introductory comments into my 3 main points for my opening statement. The first message I wanted to pass along is that technology advances. This is truly the case at Toronto, a pre-public company founded by a wireless industry veteran and 3 immigrant PhD students in 2009 who had focused their PhD thesis actually on how to equip impoverished villages in Ghana with broadband service. And they got an A on their thesis and started a company, which is what we do here in America. Fast forward 15 years and about $400 million of investment and privately funded R&D, and they really cracked the code on 2 really fundamental issues that have plagued fixed wireless in the past. The first breakthrough is the ability to reliably deliver high-speed broadband non-line of sight to a home or a business from a tower. And the challenge here is that most homes and businesses do not have line of sight to a tower. So you really need to be able to deliver high performance in non-line of sight conditions. There's generally either temporary or permanent obstructions in the way. Our radios are designed to adapt to those conditions. In fact, they recalculate the channel conditions 5,000 times every second and try to figure out what's going on to deliver that reliable broadband that feels like almost like a fiber-like experience in that regard. We always use the term last mile, but Toronto technology actually goes much further than that. Line of sight, we can do about a little over 20 miles. Near line of sight, we do 10 to 12 miles of transmission. And even non-line of sight, where we don't have any real direct path to a customer, we can go 3 to 6 miles, delivering really high-speed broadband. And that's really very, very key. The second technology breakthrough we really kind of focused on was interference and mitigation. So whether in licensed or unlicensed spectrum, and we do both, we operate in both spectrums, the ability to truly ignore radio interference, which is unique and new. We call this technology, mouthful, asynchronous burst interference cancellation, which is it's really a sophisticated type of noise cancellation, if you will. We don't jam other signals, rather we selectively listen. So we're very precise about how we hear conversations and how we send in energy. Our interference cancellation technology allows us to share and use spectrum incredibly efficiently, a factor of 5x over existing wireless technologies, which is really great. And it's really fundamental, actually, to delivering ultra-high-speed broadband, which at homes. Homes consume about 30 to 50 times more bandwidth than a typical mobile phone. Our initial product, G1, has been commercially available for 3 years. In that short time, Toronto has grown to serve communities in 26 countries, 47 states, through about 350 internet service providers. So we're pretty widely deployed. The second message I wanted to share is that finances are finite. Toronto delivers high-speed, low-latency internet at 1/10 the cost of fiber, right? And while delivering really a fiber-class service, we are even deploying gigabit by 500 services on this technology. So we agree that fiber is fantastic. In fact, we depend on fiber for our backhaul. I spent my career building networks out of fiber. Yet when it's too costly, it takes too long to install, as is the case in many U.S. communities due to topography, geography. The solution should be fiber and. It should be a combination to leverage other technologies to meet the standards. If we rely solely on one technology, we certainly will not get there in terms of providing broadband for all. So my third message is that timely deployments matter. Our technology gets up in weeks or months, while trenched and aerial fiber can take years. So we can help out there as well. Please allow me to close with an invitation. We've been honored to be visited by several of your districts to what we call Experiencing is Believing tours. When in about 60 minutes, we can actually show you the technology. And it's been a real big success. Chair McMorris, Rodgers, Chair Latta, Representative Eshu, and Joyce, thank you for allowing us to provide those demos. And my invitation to the rest of you would be to take us up on our offer, and we'd be happy to show it to you in the real. It's interesting to see. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your testimony. And Ms. Bloomfield, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your statement.
Okay, Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui and the members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify about BEAD today. I'm Shirley Bloomfield, the CEO of NTCA, and we represent about 850 community-based providers who are across 30% of our landmass. Despite operating in these really deeply rural areas, NTCA members have led the charge on deployment. On average, more than 80% of our members' customers are connected by fiber and have access to 100 megabits or better broadband. So while these new grant programs are very exciting, it wasn't grants that made this happen. It was a mix of community commitment, loans, private capital, and support from the Federal Universal Service Fund. However, there's a lot more to do. We've got a lot more Americans to connect, especially in rural areas not served by NTCA members. And there's the ongoing mission of universal service, which just begins when the network is built. BEAD is the largest infusion of broadband capital in our nation's history, and everybody wishes the BEAD program was able to roll out faster. And complicated issues do remain. But NTCA members have not sat around waiting for BEAD. Instead, they've hit the ground running, leveraging programs like USDA's Reconnect and USF. Standing up BEAD, which was coordinating between NTIA and the states, and greater vetting was always going to take time. In terms of things that we believe have worked well, first, IIJA set out critical priorities, connecting those most in need of broadband first and building networks meant to last wherever possible before resorting to good enough for now options. These provisions should help to target funds properly and avoid the failures of past broadband programs. On the last point, an analogy could be helpful. We often hear about how important it is to win the race to 5G. Nobody talks about winning the race to make sure everyone at least has LTE wireless. So why would we settle here? Why would we not want to win the race to future-proof our networks? A second promising aspect of BEAD is the upfront vetting of funding recipients. While it takes time to get this right, as the FCC's RDOF proceeding showed, failing to vet up front leads to confusion, wasted time, and Americans who are still waiting for broadband. Third, in the face of concerns about overstated coverage in locations that don't exist on the FCC's broadband map, we're pleased that NTIA and the states have been trying to refine that data to get a more accurate picture. It's not clear yet whether this effort is working, but it gives us a better chance to get things right. Fourth, I commend NTIA's willingness to take feedback and to revisit certain program rules, from letters of credit to BABA to Part 200 rules. NTIA has tried to reduce some of these program burdens. And fifth, NTCA was delighted to see Congress expressly state that IIJA should not be read to reduce the congressional mandate to achieve the universal service goals for broadband. USF is complementary to grant programs like BEAD, and this congressional reaffirmation was critical. But my members still do have concerns. First, while I mention our appreciation for efforts by NTIA and the states to improve the broadband map, many flaws still remain. These flaws have kept providers from reaching areas in need, and there's a lack of confidence in the challenge process. Second, the states, how they have defined the geographic area for BEAD is going to affect who is actually going to participate and the kind of networks that will be built. For smaller providers like my members, being required to serve every unserved location in a massive rural county will be daunting. Also, if a project area is too big, it undermines the bids for priority broadband projects. So rather than getting fiber to most locations and alternative technology to the remainder, we're going to end up with the lowest common denominator for all locations. This is a bad result for both consumers and the government. Third, the weighting of matching funds in BEAD could affect participation by smaller providers. When matching funds largely determine which applicant wins, the biggest provider with the most financial resources will always win. This is not a recipe for widespread participation or success. Fourth, other strings and concerns could deter smaller provider participation. For example, concerns about affordability measures in some states do remain, as they could undermine project sustainability. And concerns about increased costs for labor or supplies is another issue worth watching and may require additional relief. Permitting is an issue that the subcommittee has really taken the lead on. However, we continue to hear that there are lengthy delays when it comes to obtaining federal permits or state approval. So additional action is going to be important here, but so too is execution. Agencies must adhere to streamlining measures, and they need the staff to handle the applications. And a final barrier to uncertainty surrounding all of this is the FCC's USF program. Universal service support has been critical to the remarkable progress that small operators have made in providing and sustaining broadband in these rural markets, but a federal court recently declared USF contribution mechanism was unconstitutional. This decision may have a chilling effect on BEAD participation. In a recent study, more than 200 of our members indicated that the loss of USF would lead to skyrocketing rural broadband rates, plummeting deployment, and put loans at risk. If this happens, taking on more investment is the last thing that is top of mind for these providers. So BEAD offers promise, but challenges remain, and we look forward to working with all of you in the days ahead. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Levin. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Chair Latta, Ranking Member Matsui, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm Blair Levin, an equity, does this work now? An equity policy analyst. From 93 to 97, I served as FCC Chief of Staff and returned in 2009 to lead the development of that U.S. National Broadband Plan, but I'm speaking solely on behalf of myself. Let me start with a question. Why did the Capital Projects Fund, created the same year as BEAD and with a related mission, succeed in getting 98% of its money out the door while BEAD has not yet done so? There are two principal reasons. First, with capital projects, Congress did not require the allocations be based on a new FCC map. With BEAD, Congress did. Why? After the disastrous 2020 FCC RDOF auction, Congress made a reasonable decision that the smaller program, capital projects, would use population to determine each state's allocation, but BEAD, intended to close the digital access divide once and for all, needed to set allocations differently, including by using a new map. And getting the new map took over half the time that has elapsed since Congress authorized BEAD. Second, Congress only required capital projects to make progress, while Congress asked BEAD to finish the job. Capital projects, like prior deployment programs, allocates funding that all agree is insufficient and then makes incremental progress in connecting unserved areas. BEAD does the opposite. It provides a huge amount of money but requires states to fill in the entire map. It's a totally different and much more difficult policy problem. In short, and as detailed further in my written testimony, the principal causes of the BEAD timetable stem from Congress's desire to avoid the problems of waste, fraud, and abuse that plagued the 2020 RDOF auction and other deployment programs. Another criticism of BEAD characterizes NTIA's implementing the Congressional Affordability Directive as price regulation. That is wrong as a matter of law and history. As a matter of law, states cannot use BEAD to impose general price regulation on an ISP, but states can, as part of the terms of a grant, require the service to be affordable. As a matter of history, that is exactly what every FCC under both Republican and Democratic leadership has done when providing subsidies for high-cost area deployments. It's necessary to condition the government subsidy on an affordability requirement, as the subsidy creates a monopoly. Monopolies price in ways that would make the service unaffordable to many, which would be contrary to congressional intent. And if I may offer a personal note, I was chief of staff when the FCC had to implement the 1992 Cable Act, which required price regulation provisions. It was a fiasco, and on a personal level, it was the worst experience of my professional career. So to those who think the BEAD Affordability Directive is price regulation, let me say, I know price regulation. Price regulation was no friend of mine, and the Affordability Directive is no price regulation. Further, the affordability issue would not be a problem if Congress had extended the Affordability Connectivity Program. I'm not here to relitigate that issue, but it would be helpful if Congress would immediately authorize the FCC to make the National Verifier available to ISPs offering low-income programs, as that would serve the affordability goal and improve the economics of BEAD. There are other issues that will have a large impact on BEAD success that frankly have been largely overlooked. These include, for example, the workforce and supply chain issues that Chair Latta raised earlier. I think the biggest challenge for BEAD will ultimately be enforcing ISP compliance with the grant terms, an issue that has affected all such programs. And the biggest concern, as my fellow panelists just said, is the congressional commitment, in terms of making the congressional commitment to make broadband universally available and affordable, is the legal and economic threat to the current Universal Service Fund framework, particularly given the recent Fifth Circuit decision. Look, the implementation of BEAD has not been perfect. Nothing ever is. But as Intel's legendary CEO, Andy Grove, famously said, the main thing is to make the main thing the main thing. And here, as Chair Rodgers said, the main thing is to keep our country's critical century-long commitment to communications being universally accessible and affordable. BEAD is making that true, and there is a lot to do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. This concludes our witnesses' opening statements, and we'll now begin questions from the members, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, clearly emphasized that the BEAD program should be technology neutral to ensure states had flexibility to connect all Americans. This direction was blatantly ignored by NTIA when writing the rules for the BEAD program. More than 2 years later, NTIA recently released guidance to states for allowing alternative technologies to be used by BEAD recipients. Mr. Awan, what role should fixed wireless technologies like those offered by Tirana play in closing the digital divide?
Thank you, Chair Latta. Yes. First of all, I think one of the things that's most important to recognize is that this job, trying to solve the digital divide in the U.S. and serve 100% of unserved, requires a tool set, not a tool. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. It's like building a house. You have to have multiple tools. So in certain cases, LEO satellites will be the right answer. In certain cases, fixed wireless will be the right answer, unlicensed and licensed. And in certain cases, certainly fiber is the right answer. The key here is that technology changes. And Tirana, the reason I'm here speaking in part is to represent that, you know, when you put a program together that's going to last a number of years, you have to be flexible and adaptable to those changes to take advantage of the technology that's available. This particular technology, I think, can play a very big role, and I think many of the states are finding as they approach actual implementation of this that the funds required to actually fiber everywhere, which was the initial hope of the goal of the bill, are going to fall pretty far short. And I would say that it's not just the funds to build the network, but there also has to be an economic sustainability in the subsequent network so that the companies can continue to offer the service. So there's I think a pretty big stress coming in deployment of these technologies, and I think the states are going to have to avail themselves of every technology. The final thing I'll say is that wireless has now gotten to the point where we're getting beyond what a typical consumer could need. So it's a service that's as good as fiber from a consumer point of view. So you can now make a choice purely economically.
Thank you. Director Giles, how has NTIA's change in guidance so late in the process affected your state's plan?
Thank you for the question. As I stated in my opening testimony, the NOFO did pontificate that we would have to use some sort of alternative technology. And Montana, in particular, given the expensiveness of fiber, in some of our locations, is $300,000 per location. So there is no way we can close the gap without pursuing a fixed wireless solution or low orbit satellites. However, this guidance comes too late. We drafted our initial proposals all last year. We were all due, all 50 states, not just Montana, by December. And we immediately began building our application guides, and working with our providers. And so while this is welcomed, the guidance still lacks a lot of clarity of how we're to implement this, and we're open for business. So I've got to figure out how to back into that and how we can navigate and work with our providers to get these applications in. So we welcome the guidance. It would have just been more helpful had it been before states submitted their initial proposals for consideration to NTIA.
Thank you. Ms. Bloomfield, you mentioned how the Fifth Circuit's decision on FCC's Universal Service Fund program would impact whether or not your members would participate in NTIA's BEAD program, and that the loss of the USF support could end up leading to skyrocketing broadband rates and decreased investment in broadband overall. There are already several federal programs that support broadband investment. Why are these programs so linked, and how do your members view the role of BEAD compared to USF in my last minute and 10 seconds?
Okay, really fast. I think that's part of the confusion is you've got capital programs that like BEAD or Reconnect or ARPA money has been. Universal service is really the ability for these providers to actually, in high-cost, difficult-to-serve areas, to be able to do it as a cost recovery mechanism. So it is not upfront funding. That is what capital programs do. This is to actually help build the business case for why you're able to build that network out to that rural community, to that farming community. It's the ability for those providers to be able to do that cost recovery, and also it's an affordability program. It is taking down what would be a typical rate, comparable and affordable per the 96 Act, and saying that instead of, what that metric might be, that those rural consumers, even at a $20 higher than urban rate, would be able to afford that broadband access. So the program is really incredibly complementary. The Fifth Circuit ruling, if that goes into effect, honestly, again, I think there's going to be, my members have said 70% of their deployment next year will be on hold, will be on ice, and I think that's bad for American consumers.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired, and before I yield to the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, just want to also mention we have another subcommittee running downstairs, so most of the members are also on that subcommittee, so you have members coming and going from both subcommittees right now, but I just want to let you know that in advance. And I will recognize the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The BEAD program's success is tied to ensuring every American has access to affordable broadband. With the Affordable Connectivities Program recent funding lapse, it is more important than ever for NTIA to carefully review the affordability components of state BEAD plans. Mr. Levin, is NTIA's review of the low-cost options in state plans consistent with the statute that created BEAD?
Yes.
Okay. As a follow-up, what would the impact on consumers and connectivity if NTIA was unable to help state plans meet BEAD affordability goals?
Well, as the FCC has recognized under both Republican and Democratic leadership, when you are subsidizing a company to essentially build a monopoly, the pricing of that monopoly will not maximize the number of subscribers, which is what Congress really wants. And so there has to be some price constraints. We can argue about the nature of the price constraints, but fundamentally this is a grant, and you are allowed to set grant terms, and the affordability, whether it be in RDOF, which had such things, or the earlier Connect America Fund, or the earlier High Cost Fund, there were always some constraints on the pricing so that rural people in particular would not pay higher rates than urban people. And if we didn't have it, then you would have a different pricing mechanism that reflects a monopoly's interest.
Okay, Ms. Bloomfield, how would funding the Affordable Connectivity Program help small providers, particularly in BEAD, and provide more affordable broadband to consumers and customers in need?
So, having that low-cost program is really important, and we were very sorry to see that go away. I think that as Congress continues to take a look at universal service through the working group that is certainly bicameral and bipartisan at this point, looking to find ways to take that affordability factor into the universal service program so that we're not doing this annual, will there be, affordable broadband, will there not be? Because, I look at my companies, they spend a lot of time and effort making sure that consumers in their service territory were able to be connected to that program, those who needed it.
Okay. We're looking into the Universal Service Fund, and particularly as we're members of the bipartisan group, we are, sort of, the chairman and I. You're filling in, that's very good. But, I'm committed, as I know the members of the group, to strengthening the Universal Service Fund and ensuring it remains resilient for years to come. Ms. Bloomfield, there are already several federal programs that we know support broadband investment. Why is the Universal Service Fund so important? And how do you members really view the role of BEAD compared to USF?
So it's thinking of it as a complementary program where you have the ability to take upfront grant money to actually build the network, whether it's fiber or it's wireless, whatever the infrastructure might be. The Universal Service Program was constituted in the '96 Act to basically say that regardless of where you lived, you had access to comparable and affordable services. So it is for providers, it is that sense of I can make this build, but now I can recover the cost to build to an area or to a community or a group of populations that simply cannot have you can't make the business case to build out to them. Okay. So it's done in arrears. So it is literally kind of a repayment for the upfront investment that you've made.
Absolutely. And Mr. Levin, how do you see USF contributing to the success of BEAD?
Surely
Same way.
companies and others serving rural America have two problems. One is the capital cost, and the second is the operating costs. Universal Service assists with both of those. Without it, you will have the kind of disaster that she has predicted.
Okay, as I noted in my opening remarks, Congress structured BEAD as a deliberative, multi-phase process with opportunities for NTI to review and strengthen the program through back and forth with states and stakeholders. Mr. Lev, what are the consequences if BEAD implementation is rushed? What metrics should we instead be using to measure the success of the program?
Well, I think as Congress correctly saw, the RDOF program done in the final days of the Trump administration was a total disaster. It used a map that was inadequate and funded places that should have been funded. It had participants who could not deliver on the promises they made. A promise made is not a promise kept. You would have other kinds of problems like that. I think everyone recognizes that problem, and that's why Congress wanted a much more deliberate, thorough process.
Okay, I can't see how much time I have left. 3 seconds and that's it. So I have questions I will certainly provide for the record. I would yield back my 3 seconds. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. And now I'm delighted to recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Rodgers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bloomfield, the Biden administration touts NTIA's Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program as a program built for local providers with local solutions. However, we hear concerns from providers about being forced to offer a certain rate and comply with burdensome labor requirements, making them reconsider participating in the BEAD program. Have these requirements caused your members to question whether they should participate in the BEAD program?
You know, I am very excited about this program, but yes, indeed, I've got members that are taking a hard look at it, and I've got some members who think that it might not be workable for them. I think that states have done various levels of work in terms of things like the affordability. I will give Ms. Deanne in Montana a lot of props. I think Montana created a flexible rate that will help to bring my providers to the table in terms of participating. In terms of things like that you've raised, the ability to do affordable labor. All of those things, when you're looking at rates that are those rural rates, are the urban rates, and why are they not comparable, is going to make it more difficult. So I do think, I would love to see my members all participate. I think there are going to be a lot that will be very hesitant. I think there will be a lot that will be doing some evaluation. And at the end of the day, it's going to have to make sense for them to actually serve some of these communities, which we have to recognize are the hardest to serve communities of all. They are the unserved. So when you think about what you're actually trying to do as a mission with the BEAD program, it is taking the most difficult areas and trying to make those economically feasible.
Yes, and that's important that we stay focused on the unserved, underserved. Director Giles, congratulations on being the first state to launch your grant application portal for BEAD funding. You were quoted in a recent news article saying, "Is it my job to be telling companies what they charge?" I would say it's not. How do you navigate the burdensome requirements of the Biden administration's to find a low-cost option that was flexible enough to be a possibility and not discourage participation in the state of Montana?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. So in Montana, as I stated, a lot of our locations actually cost over $300,000. So when you're asking our companies to go to the most remote areas and taking a haircut on the other side, when there's simply only one or two households, it's just the nature of Montana. It's very rural with very low population density. So with that, what we looked at was trying to find a data-driven solution versus just putting our finger in the air of what is a low-cost option that we can offer that will not, hopefully, discourage participation in the program. So we built ours on the FCC Urban Rate Survey, utilized Western States data, and that came out to about $69 and some odd change. We rounded that up to $70. We were very fortunate that we worked with NTIA very closely and made our pitch. They knew it was data-driven since it was not an arbitrary number, and they did approve that. Now, whether there's still a discouragement in the program is yet to be seen. Montana providers are concerned about the long tail of having to hold that price firm. Inflation is real. Everything is a little bit different in our state, depending on region. So, but we're at least pleased with the outcome.
Thank you. Mr. Alwan, NTIA recently released proposed guidance regarding alternative technologies like unlicensed fixed wireless, low Earth orbit satellite services. What are your thoughts on NTIA's proposed guidance that finally allows BEAD to truly be a technology-neutral program as Congress intended?
Yeah, so we definitely welcome the clarification, and I think even more is going to be needed here because as the rubber hits the road, so to speak, I think holding on to 100% coverage of unserved and underserved is going to be a pretty tough road, especially with some of the comments made about bidding and who's going to bid, given the challenges of running the business, not just getting the funds and building the network, but then running the business thereafter. So I think it's really important now that we recognize that all these technologies have stepped up that can deliver an end-game broadband experience that don't require the same type of initial investment.
Thank you. The timing is also so crucial in this program, and Director Giles, I come from Eastern Washington. Snow and weather conditions definitely impact our construction season, and even a slight delay in the approval could cause much longer delays on the ground, and I know Montana has similar issues. How has NTIA's timing of announcing guidance and approvals affected your ability to get this program up and running?
Thank you for the question. I think from a state's perspective, that is probably our largest challenge. I think we all agree we don't want the program to be rushed. This is a lot of money. There's a lot of stakes on the line. This is about connecting the last of the last that need broadband, right? However, the guidance has not been timely. At the jump, throughout the process, we start implementing our program, and then we get new guidance, and we have to go backwards. So specifically with alternative technology, that came out almost a year too late. We welcome the guidance, but now all states have to go back and incorporate that in our initial proposals and try to figure out how to make it workable with our providers.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your insights. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to dig in more to the low-cost plan requirements. So, Mr. Levin, the bipartisan infrastructure law explicitly allows each state to set its own cost for this plan and the NTIA is given the authority to approve or deny a state's proposal, and this low-cost option requirement of service providers is a term of an agreement in exchange for government funding to build out monopoly networks, which will in turn give these providers more customers. So, Mr. Levin, is what I just described rate regulation by any common or general use of the term?
Certainly not the way we use that on Wall Street.
All right, so we saw a rushed and poorly designed broadband plan under the Trump administration, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And Mr. Levin, your testimony lays out both why Congress intentionally moved in a different direction with the BEAD program, but also how problems with that fund are now also causing problems with BEAD. So again, Mr. Levin, can you explain why it's so important that the administration take a deliberative, thoughtful approach to implementing this historic $42 billion program?
Yes. As I explained in the written testimony, if you simply want to make progress, you do what you did in the capital projects. You say, here's $10 billion, fund good projects, move the ball down the field. If you want to score a touchdown, you want to get to the end zone. It's a very different problem, as I'm sure the fellow panelists in Montana, if you would understand. It's what she has said, that trying to get everywhere requires a lot of different tools. And so the way you do the mapping, the way you do everything is much more complex. What we saw in the RDOF process, as you said earlier, were a number of problems that Congress wanted to avoid. But to avoid those problems, it takes a more thoughtful, thorough process, and that's what I believe Congress did in the infrastructure bill.
All right, thank you. The last thing, I'm concerned that after all the time and effort that the states, the NTIA, and the other stakeholders have put into implementing BEAD, that it will be torn away, essentially, if Trump's Project 2025 plan becomes reality. So I was going to ask you what would happen if a new Trump administration were to follow Project 2025's call to rewrite the BEAD program and, as they say, quote, set fresh priorities, in your opinion?
Well, in the Project 2025, Commissioner Carr laid out what would be the agenda and talked about changing the priorities. What I would say is, using Montana as an example and talking about what she was just talking about in terms of the timetable, if you suddenly say, okay, we're just going to stop everything, I mean, she's on the 10-yard line. She is ready to score for Montana. NTIA is ready to give her money. And if you suddenly say stop and let's have another winter go by, I think that would be, or another summer go by, I should say, I think that would be a disaster. In addition, I would say Project 2025 talks about firing civil servants. And a lot of the people who have done these programs, both at the FCC and NTIA, are civil servants, and they know more about this than anybody. They're very committed public servants. They serve honorably and well under both Republicans and Democrats. You suddenly fire them, that could cause massive delays in terms of this program. So from a perspective of getting the job done, whatever happens in the election, I would hope that we just kind of move forward and get this done.
All right, thank you. I like the football analogies, too. Thanks a lot.
They seem to be in.
Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize the favorite son of Florida and Greece, Mr. Bilirakis.
That's a first. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I thank the chairman again for holding this important hearing. My rural counties are extremely interested in a successful and timely implementation of the BEAD program. In fact, so are my constituents. They're very anxious. Telecommunications policy is typically behind the scenes topic, but there have been several newspaper articles and letters to the editor on the BEAD program since its creation. People are eager for the potential this program has. I represent quite a few rural areas in Florida. Ms. Bloomfield, just like my constituents, I'm sure your members are anxious for BEAD money to start being awarded so they can begin deploying networks. One of the requirements for participating in BEAD is that providers must put up at least a 25% match in funds. Earlier this summer, You sent a letter to Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson that included a concern about excessive weighting of match funds in BEAD scoring. Can you elaborate on your concern and problems that could arise if NTIA makes allocations based on the lowest bid or highest amount of match, as opposed to considering the experience and history of an internet provider?
Thank you so much for the question. And indeed, we have seen what happens when you do a little bit of a race to the bottom with a reverse auction. When we look back at the FCC's RDOF program, and the problem was, you're already getting folks who are turning back that funding saying, you know what, at the time, I said I would build it for that amount of money, but ooh, who knew? I actually cannot afford to build it at that amount of time. So those consumers who actually thought a few years ago they would be probably first in line to get broadband deployment are now really at the end of the line. So we look at that and we think, first of all, again, reverse auction, race to the bottom, that's a problem. Second of all, for smaller providers, 25% match, and some states are making noises about going higher in that match. All you're going to do is, instead of getting those community-based providers who really know the area, who know how to fill in the gaps of the areas that they're already serving so well, you're going to discourage their participation because they simply will not be able to compete in that kind of environment, particularly if we look at very large bidding areas. So all the way around, we'd like to see more flexibility in that area. We'd certainly like to see less of an emphasis and priority on that. I think that will bring more community-based providers to the table, and I think those are exactly the kind of providers you want to be bidding in BEAD.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Ms. Giles, I apologize if this question has been asked, but I was down in the Healthcare Committee. So I noticed Montana's approved version of an initial proposal, Volume 2, included a sentence that said, and I'll quote, "While the Montana Broadband Office recognizes the importance of affordable access to broadband, we philosophically disagree with the NTIA's position that rate requirements are not rate setting." What instruction or feedback did you receive from NTIA that inform your understanding of the NTIA's position on rate requirements?
Thank you for the question. So the position of NTIA is given to the states and as mentioned on this panel earlier, is that this is a voluntary program, so it's not rate setting. However, I would state that is a farce. It's a $42.5 billion program. In Montana, we call this a family affair. Companies, big and small, all different types of industries are going to need to come to the table to get this done. This isn't a Montana issue. This is a nationwide issue. We do philosophically disagree with the low cost and the structure of the program as it relates to that with NTIA. But as I stated, we were able to work with our providers, take a data-driven solution, and we're able to work through that. I think time will tell whether it has a discouraging effect to our providers in terms of applying to the program.
Thank you. Historically, we have seen things go wrong with telecommunications programs. Overbuilding communities is certainly a culprit of wasted funding. But we also need to make sure that funding is not allocated to fly-by-night operations, and that regulations do not impede long-term affordability of new connections. Otherwise, we all never connect the rest of America, no matter how much we spend. So let's keep that in mind. And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to both Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui. And I thank our panelists. This hearing is very important, and the NTIA's Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, the single largest investment in broadband access and affordability in our nation's history, is critical. I'm so proud of the work Democrats on this committee have done to bridge the digital divide that starts with the historic broadband investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law we passed last Congress. At a time when high-speed internet access has become a necessity rather than a luxury, an investment of this magnitude and scope is providing our country the resources needed to remain competitive globally. The implementation process for BEAD, the BEAD program as laid out by the bipartisan infrastructure law, is intentionally thoughtful. The task of spurring significant investments in broadband deployment across 56 geographically and economically unique states and territories is no small feat, and I commend the NTIA for the work that they have done thus far. As of now, 40 states and territories have received approval on their initial proposals for the BEAD program, including my home state of New York, which is allocated over $664 million to deploy or upgrade networks and ensure that all New Yorkers have access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet service. And let me also give a shout out to our governor, Governor Hochul, and her team at the New York Broadband Office for all of their hard work as well. Just as the underlying statute's implementation process was deliberate, so too was the inclusion of key affordability provisions. Despite many Republican members' attempts to politicize affordability programs by describing them as rate regulation, the inarguable truth is that for millions of American households, affordability is the primary obstacle to reliable connectivity. The BEAD program, particularly when coupled with a successful broadband affordability program like the Affordable Connectivity Program, is designed to address those affordability concerns, bringing broadband infrastructure to unserved areas while also providing more affordable plans for low-income households. The truth is that the process of implementing any major federal program is almost always going to be fraught with challenges both expected and unforeseen. However, it is only by being thoughtful and diligent in the crafting of the underlying statute, receiving stakeholder feedback, and implementing the program that we can hope to be successful. It may be tempting to try to hastily roll out a new program in an effort to win headlines, but it simply does not work out well in the end. The rushed rollout at the Trump administration's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which saw a frightening number of provider defaults, proves that we need to focus on results and not headlines. Unfortunately, rather than voice any legitimate concerns and attempt to work in a bipartisan manner, many of my colleagues across the aisle have refused to do so. Not a single Republican member of this committee voted for the BEAD program and have offered nothing substantive to improve the program or even to address broadband affordability. House Republicans have already allowed the wildly successful Affordable Connectivity Program, perhaps one of the single best tools to address affordability concerns, to experience a lapse in funding. And now they want to cry foul and attack the statutory requirement that these taxpayer-funded networks actually provide an affordable service. I'll never understand why some in Congress not only refuse to support legislation to help low-income families, but actively oppose seemingly all efforts to do so. Nevertheless, I remain ready and willing to work with any member of Congress that is serious about closing the digital divide. Together, we can ensure this historic investment helps as many Americans as possible. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry about that. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes for questions to the witnesses.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's kind of cold. I get that bump up in salary and everything. Vice chairmanship.
The mark next to your name threw me.
It's taken away already. Though Gus will appreciate the fact. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here today. Michigan received the fourth highest BEAD allocation in the country, $1.6 billion, and that, I believe, highlights how serious the digital divide in the state, especially in rural areas like my district. But with all this money, we must ensure that it's being used effectively and efficiently. Reports from states across the country about the Biden-Harris administration's process and the resulting delays have been concerning, to say the least. Our constituents need connection now, not bureaucratic backlog, and I'm particularly worried about the impact of unnecessary labor requirements that the NTIA has more or less mandated outside of the parameters of the original law. Specifically, NTIA in the BEAD Novo encourages states to require the use of directly employed personnel instead of contractors or subcontractors, the use of project labor agreements, labor peace agreements, and to commit to union neutrality. The overwhelming number of ISPs in this country do not have unionized workforces or rely only on directly employed personnel. That just doesn't make sense for many companies. I'm concerned that NTIA's requirements could deter ISP participation in already difficult labor markets because they are extremely burdensome and administratively difficult and inefficient. Most significantly, these requirements are nowhere to be found in the IIJA. Ms. Bloomfield, thanks for being here. You represent hundreds of smaller companies that serve some of the most rural and high-cost areas of the country. Do all your members directly employ the teams that will do the actual physical deployment of network facilities, or do some of them rely on contractors?
They do not have all of their own construction operations. As a matter of fact, I would say the vast majority contract out. Only my largest community-based providers would actually have their own construction teams.
How have your members been deploying broadband networks in rural areas?
Well, you know, because we've got a number of our providers that actually serve your constituents up there in
And may their tribe increase.
And you know, I think I will say, they have been really busy, though. My members are still building out beyond their own territory. They've got fiber to 84% of their customer base, but they have now, over the course of COVID, you know, after COVID, we all realized how important broadband was. They've edged out further into those unserved communities. So they've been really busy. They're also very big recipients of the USDA Reconnect program. So they've been using ARPA, Reconnect. Universal Service has been really critical. But, you know, they do worry about labor because, again, getting that labor workforce into a rural community is an additional challenge. It's not like you're in a large metropolitan area where you've got a lot to choose from. And
So you say we don't have enough workers?
oh, we need more workers, yes. That should be your next hearing on how we really increase that construction crew, that fiber designer, that network designer. Absolutely, we have a workforce shortage.
Yeah. Ms. Giles, could you speak to that as well, about the workforce and needs of the workforce, and whether in Montana you found a way to achieve that?
Thank you for the question. I don't think I have a magic 8-ball to achieve it, but I'll get to work on that. So, but to Ms. Bloomfield's point, we are concerned about workforce. The requirements, these companies are very small, so you add on all the nuances of the requirements. It's more of a paperwork game, right, for them. So we are concerned about their ability to comply, let alone have the workers. They do contract a lot of this out in Montana as well. I think beyond having a shortage, we're looking at about 3,000 shortages across Montana in workforce. We also have one of the largest housing shortages in the country. So even if we can attract the worker, we have state employees that often have to live in hotels for the first few months. Even us as members of cabinet, when we first came in, we had to do that. The housing shortage is significant. So even if we can hire them, I'm not sure where we're going to put them. So we've got a multi-pronged problem that we're trying to address, both with our housing task force that the governor created and working with our youth system to create a workforce training program.
Okay, so it's all hands on deck right now, trying to find that 8-ball. And maybe, Mr. Chairman, that would be a good hearing on workforce, to look further at how we can do that, including getting people decide to go back to work as well. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and that's a very good idea, because it's the same thing I hear across my district, and also find the trained workers and bucket trucks and everything else. So that would be a good hearing. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas's 33rd District for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and wasn't going to comment on workforce shortage, but when I think about the immigration issues and challenges that we've been having here in Congress to address our H-1B visa shortages, and obviously farm workers and other guest worker programs in here, just our failure to address a comprehensive bill has really led to a lot of these issues around workforce. And the state of Texas, one of our leading economists, Dr. Ray Perryman, has said that we actually have more jobs than we have people. So it's something that that we probably all need to roll up our sleeves and kind of move past the politics and get to work on. But I want to talk about improving the lives of everyday Americans across this country. I know that the Biden and Harris administration and Democrats in this Congress, that we want to deliver broadband to people's homes. That's a big deal for us. And is it going to be hard work? Absolutely, it's going to be hard work. But I think that we need to roll up our sleeves and try to continue to get something done. It's good for rural America. It's good for urban America, like that I represent. It's something that's going to connect all of us. And we've heard from a number of witnesses today that the BEAD program is just one way that the Biden-Harris administration has invested in American infrastructure. And so while it is the biggest pot of money, as Ms. Bloomfield noted in her testimony, nobody is just sitting around waiting. In Texas alone, we have already received more than $160 million from NTIA through the various bipartisan infrastructure law programs, and we also received about $100 million from the Biden-Harris USDA for broadband through the Reconnect program, and about $700 million through the American Rescue Plan. And so Texans have received about $1 billion through the Affordable Connectivity Program before my Republican colleagues decided that we were not going to look for additional funds to support the program. And I know that ACP would have stretched BEAD dollars even further by ensuring that customers and return on investment on the other end of the build out. And so for those of you keeping track, that's nearly $2 billion to our state. And obviously as fast as we are growing, which is one of the reasons why we have more jobs than we have people, because we're growing just so astronomically fast. We know that this money has helped Texas deliver broadband and help get homes connected, both in rural Texas and again in urban Texas like I represent. And so, Mr. Levin, you discussed in your testimony how some of these different programs were created with different goals in mind. Given how hard it is to actually deliver broadband to people's home, can you discuss why it's important to have a multitude of programs working together but avoiding duplication to help meet our goals?
Yeah. So there have been a series of broadband programs. Actually, I worked with the National Urban League, created something the Latimer Plan in 2020, and we looked at it and said there needs to be far better coordination in the federal government of these broadband programs. And I think NTIA has taken some steps in that regard. I think there's some legislation that would move that forward. There are a variety of different reasons, but ultimately it just, if you're a city or you're a state and you have various different problems, you want to be able to efficiently access whatever government program is best for you. At the end of the day, the programs are fundamentally about subsidizing the capital expense or subsidizing the operating expense. By giving, the ACP was critical because that meant that you were going to have more customers. And a consulting group, BCG, estimated that it would essentially increase the value of BEAD dollars by 25% if ACP were to continue. And of course, now it's expired. So, and I testified in the Senate about this a couple months ago. As a result, a lot more, there's going to have to be a lot more decisions to use cheaper wireless facilities, and a lot of people are going to lose, particularly in Texas, access to fiber because the BEAD dollars don't go as far. So you need the combination of the two to make the total business plan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope that's something that all news networks talk about, not just a few, about how important these dollars were to people that lived in a variety of different places across Texas and the rest of the United States.
Yeah, and Texas, by the way, is getting the most money of any state in terms of BEAD allocation.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia's 1st District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. It's good to see you. Director Giles, it's good to see you again, and I can certainly understand why the state of Montana would want to poach one of Georgia's finest and one of our Georgia peaches, and thank you for all the work you did in the state of Georgia. I'm sorry for all those bad things I said about you when you were in the governor's office, but anyway, no, seriously, thank you for being here. And I want to point this out because what we're talking about here about high-speed broadband access, unfortunately, we're trying to fill the digital divide. And as you know, Director Giles, there are two Georgias. There's Atlanta and everywhere else. And we're talking about everywhere else in the rural part of Georgia, particularly in South Georgia. So that's very important. And we all know, everyone on the panel and everyone here knows about the strain on permitting agencies, not only at the federal level, not only at state level, but also at the local level. That's why when you got 56 states and territories all trying to build out roughly within the same 4-year time period, that speed in the permitting process will be a key to BEAD success. We all understand that, and that's why I introduced H.R. 3557, the American Broadband Deployment Act, which would streamline the permitting process by establishing timelines and shot clocks, if you will, for reasonable application fees. So without these permitting reforms to reduce the burden on these agencies and on those trying to lay the lines, potential delays will lead to not only rising costs but wasted government funding, and we don't want that. Director Giles, what kind of steps is Montana taking that to streamline permitting? Can you share that with us?
Yes, sir, and good to see you again as well. So obviously we're working essentially what we know with the law to be true. The guidance from NTIA has been minimal at best. It's much more a restatement of the law and the processes that are in place at the federal, and obviously we have our own at the state level, with a declaration of there's going to be a joint responsibility of how this is going to work, yet how that joint responsibility is going to be defined is yet to be seen. So we've essentially just been working with our local and state agencies internally to try to get ready to what we know to be true. MEPA in Montana, the Montana Environmental Protection Act is obviously in place. It mirrors much of NEPA. So we've been just trying to work the best we can internally, because right now we don't know the rules of the road, if you want to use that term, as to what's going to be expected on the state side fully as it relates to requirements from NTIA.
Well, your governor, who is a good friend and a former member of this committee, as a matter of fact, certainly will be great at helping with that, and he understands it all too well. But what about NTIA's ever-changing guidance on permitting? That's got to be throwing you a curve, and how's that helping or hurting with your preparation for rolling out BEAD?
That's a great question. So I think we all know that permitting is probably one of the more important issues when it relates to broadband deployment, right? There's a lot of federal hoops and hurdles, state hoops and hurdles, and then local as well. So it does require a lot of local coordination, state coordination, and working with our federal counterparts. So we're open for business. My application's already open, yet I don't have full clarity on how we're going to do environmental. As stated, we are working through what we know to be true, that is the law, and just working through the basic guidance we do have. But just recently, we were informed we have to use a permitting process that they want that will not be available for 6 to 8 months. So I think we're more left with questions than answers, and just trying to do the best we can and keep our companies calm, that we will work through the process and we will continue to push on NTIA to see what guidance will come down the pipe. But we need clarity soon, because at least 3 states are open. And as stated by a member of the committee earlier, 40 states are already approved. So that 1-year shot clock has already started.
Right.
The final proposal.
Well, let me tell you this. No matter what sector of our economy we're talking about, or wherever I go, it's always the same. Permitting, regulations, crushing us, whether it be energy, healthcare, broadband, whatever it may be. That is something. Mr. Bloomfield, how are your members already impacted by permitting, and how are those affected, and how are those effects being mitigated?
So, Congressman, we strongly support your legislation and really appreciate your insight into offering to put that out there, because permitting is a problem. And I think, and again, it goes down through every single layer that you noted. So we're, looking to figure out how you solve that. Honestly, part of that is getting bodies. It's getting bodies who can actually process the applications, getting bodies who understand what they are doing. So training people appropriately, making sure that they can do it. RUS, for example, has 6 people who actually do the processing of some of those permitting on the federal level for that program. That is not nearly sufficient for the amount of funding that is going out the door. The other thing is, I think we can be more common sense about it. If something has been previously disrupted for construction, that should actually have a pretty quick approval process. NTIA is trying to deal with NEPA and with some of the historical preservation, but it's moving slowly at best.
Great. Don't tell me about historical preservation coming from Savannah, Georgia, the largest historical district in the nation. We know all about how that can hold things up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here, and thank you for this important work. So thank y'all.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida's 9th District for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden-Harris administration had a bold vision, internet for all Americans, especially our rural areas, and it built upon an amazing tradition by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by President Johnson, among others, when they electrified so many areas of rural America. You know, we talked a lot about the infrastructure law, and I'll get into that, but the good work in our state actually started with the American Rescue Plan. When we passed that in March 11th of 2021, my state of Florida got $144 million. We saw working between the Biden administration and the DeSantis administration that funding get deployed in areas like South Osceola County that I have the honor of representing, ranch country, where we saw 791 folks served in places like Yeehaw Junction and Kenansville, another 1,000 plus folks served in Deer Creek and Bull Creek, folks who are doing important work to help feed America, and finally getting the first part of that internet. Of course, Spectrum worked very closely in that build out with the state of Florida. And then, of course, to the infrastructure law signed in November of 2021, a few months after the American Rescue Plan. And we saw our state submit the first letter of intent in July of 2022. And then after that, we got our first notice of the amounts we were eligible for, $1.17 billion for the state of Florida. And we just had Secretary Raimondo in here just a few months ago talking about how a lot of this will wrap up this fall. We know this is a huge undertaking. We've talked about 50 states and multiple territories and just trying to work on this for the whole nation. Mr. Levin, what do you think are some of the keys for various states as far as making sure all these plans, particularly Volume 1 plans, are approved for this October, I believe, is when Secretary Raimondo had mentioned was sort of their key deadline?
Well, I think the states have done a terrific job of starting from scratch and building up broadband offices. Most of them have now been approved. I think the actual number is 48. I think NTIA put out a note this morning saying 48 plans have been approved.
So we're probably going to meet this October deadline then?
Yeah, no, I think we're going to meet it. I think the challenge now, and it's a different challenge, there is a mapping challenge in terms of the grant, which is very, very difficult. I think the states need to start taking advantage of some of the things that NTIA has done that get no publicity, but I think are really valuable and important. For example, when you give a grant, how do you document getting the receipts? And there's certain kinds of ways of expediting that and making it much better.
And that's partially our job as the oversight committee
that's
to
right.
make sure it's being spent wisely.
I think that, and I think all the panelists would agree with this, that it's very important to work with the ISPs to get as many of them kind of at the table in the game as possible as they move to the next thing. And as I said earlier, we're on the 10-yard line now. Let's get the ball over the touchdown. But that really means everybody has to come together.
Well, and we have a bipartisan bill with Congresswoman Kamek on this committee, the Rural Internet Improvement Act, requiring Department of Ag to use FCC maps to determine eligible areas. So we are working on that in a bipartisan fashion. I was excited to see August 26th, just last month, NTIA finally starts considering satellite internet. You know, we launched those Starlink satellites from Central Florida. We'll soon be seeing Kuiper Belt being launched. It'd be great to hear from you, Ms. Bloomfield, about how important it is for those hardest to reach areas for low Earth orbit satellites as part of this broadband mixed. Fiber, you know, has a lot of strong aspects to it, but there's some areas it's going to be harder to reach otherwise. So where do you think that fits in?
Well, I do believe it's going to take every tool in the toolkit. If we're really serious about internet for all, you're going to have to look at everything depending on your topography, your population density, all of those things. You know, we are very fiber-centric because we think it's a future-proof technology. We also think that, you know, the other thing for a rural area to keep in mind is the fact that you're also talking about your OpEx. So the operating expenses in the long run become a lot shorter with fiber because in our areas we have what we call truck rolls, and they may be 3-4 hours where somebody's going out to do some maintenance. So at the end of the day, fiber first for sure, but will those other technologies have a role to play? Absolutely, if we're really going to be committed to making sure that everybody does get service.
Sure, because my area, we have some folks clustered near each other, but some they could be 5-10 miles away from their nearest neighbor. So I appreciate your comments, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas 14th District, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bloomfield, I'm going to come to you first. Under the BEAD guidelines, states are allowed to collect BEAD project proposals. We've been talking about that. Areas as small as a single address or entire predefined area units like a census block or a county. I don't think we should be prioritizing bureaucratic convenience over efficient and effective projects. I'm a former business owner, 35 years in the air conditioning company. Your organization has expressed concern to NTIA that larger project areas will deter participation by smaller ISPs. We're talking about that. How can we apply the lessons from the past broadband programs to find the right balance of BEAD project areas? And the follow-up to that is, I don't know how many members organization you have, but are y'all meeting in groups and having, I mean, we're doing this committee hearing, but are y'all meeting in groups and are y'all sharing all that? I yield to you.
Oh, thank you so much for the question. So yeah, the project size is really, again, I think community-based providers are so well positioned to do this. They know what rural service, they've got 7 customers per square mile. They know what it takes. They know what it costs. They know the challenges that they're going to have out there. So, here in DC, we're, 400 or 500 per square mile. So it's a matter of economics. So the smaller the area, the better opportunity to get priority broadband built. And I think to be able to then address how you serve those really far off parts of the territory. So, and we've seen that be very successful. The smaller the areas, the more the communities can kind of fill in that Swiss cheese effect. So that is certainly to answer your first question. And then to your second point, I think that as we go forward, putting this priority on making sure that, we're making the smart decisions does mean having those conversations. So, I have 850 companies. We spend every opportunity together to compare notes.
Is that annually or is that quarterly?
Oh, it's all the time. We're a trade association.
But I mean, do you have an annual meeting that's
Yeah, we do.
that we
have
could
an annual-
attend?
yeah,
Members
we
of
should
Congress could
probably-
actually attend.
yeah. So we have an annual, we have fall, we have regional meetings. So we go around the country to see what is each region thinking. Because you know what works in Texas isn't necessarily going to work in Montana. So the ability to compare notes. And the other part that I think has been really important has been getting the vendors to the table to talk about the technology and to also be working with these state broadband offices, both the NTIA folks as well as the folks that are actually the officers in the state. That collaboration, those discussions, those stakeholder meetings talking about what is working and what isn't working is a really critical component. They can also compare notes on mapping. And then I will say it's kind of the undercurrent that we've got here at this hearing is that mapping is a big part of the issue here. And until we get mapping done better and more accurate, I think the work that everybody has to do is going to be a lot more complicated.
So are you inviting folks like Director Giles to come in and sit in on y'all's meeting?
We actually do, absolutely.
Does she show up? You don't have to answer
Oh,
that.
yeah,
No.
she's terrific. We talk frequently.
So, Director Giles, I'll come to you. Montana has had a thoughtful, sensible approach to defining project areas. Montana's a huge state, not quite as big as Texas, okay, but big, and yet you chose smaller area units in the form of census block groups for BEAD projects. Why?
Thank you. That's a great question. It was a lot of back and forth, honestly, over about 6 or 8 months with our providers. To Ms. Bloomfield's point, this is a dialogue. It wasn't, just a heavy hand. Census block groups were just kind of the right size. We wanted to have a big enough of an area, given our state size, so we were not, trying to put together 1,000 little puzzle pieces. But we also are allowing our providers the flexibility to identify those areas up front, which are too expensive for them to deploy fiber, so we can see it through their lens and then have those conversations immediately with them and industry. So it was just essentially the right balance given our state size and our state need.
Did the NTI weigh in on that? Were they giving you conflicting messages, signals about that? Did they change those goalposts, if you will?
No, sir. This is one area that they gave states full flexibility, given the uniqueness of all the states. We pled our case in our IP2 and talked through the rhyme and reason and the stakeholder outreach with our providers, and we had it successfully approved.
Okay. So you've had delayed guidance and revisions to previous guidance impacting the process in states like Montana. If you could, in a sentence, encapsulate what they should do different, what would you say to the NTIA?
Consider the impact of their own timelines with the impact of state operations.
And stay the friggin' course. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California's 29th District for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lara and Ranking Member Matsui, for having this important hearing, and I appreciate the witnesses coming forth and giving their knowledge and opinions on what is going on out there with the program. I'm glad that we're gathered here today to discuss the issue of federal broadband infrastructure funding successfully reaching our communities, something that this administration and House Democrats have had a tremendous amount of work on. I, like many of my colleagues, was proud to vote for the bipartisan infrastructure law that created the $42 billion BEAD program to help build and deploy broadband infrastructure in unserved and underserved areas. Unfortunately, that bill got no support from my Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this committee. And while some are complaining about the process and length of time to get this money out, I also want to point out that there are several Republicans, including many on this committee, who asked the administration for a delay in the program. I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, 2 letters signed by my members of this committee asking the NTIA to delay the BEAD process to wait for more accurate maps.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What this says to me is that attacks now on the time it is taking to thoughtfully administer this program are purely political. In fact, as we near the end of this Congress, I'm trying to think of any effort the majority has had to increase access to affordable internet for all Americans. Their most impactful action on the digital divide actually sent us in the wrong direction. I'm of course speaking about their inaction that allowed the Affordable Connectivity Program to expire, a program that helped millions of American families access affordable broadband in every corner of our country. In spite of this, we're once again hearing that the BEAD affordability requirements in the IIJA are an example of, quote, rate regulation. You have to wonder, where exactly do my Republican colleagues land on this issue when it comes to the funding? The affordability requirements in the infrastructure bill exist to ensure that these investments are accessible to families that need them the most. I think if we want to talk about affordable broadband, maybe we should have a hearing on the Access Affordable Connectivity Program and the negative impact that is allowing it to run out of funding is having on all American families. On that note, I think it's important that we talk about the impact that the Affordable Connectivity Program's expiration has had on the BEAD rollout. For example, Mr. Levin, in your testimony, you reference how the ACP expiring has, quote, caused untold additional hours of state and ISP resources, end quote, as they had to spend the past 2 years developing multiple BEAD plans for how to allocate funds with an ACP and without one.
Yes, that's right, because if you are doing your plans, and whether it be in the geographic areas or otherwise, the economic impact of having BEAD or not having BEAD is fundamentally different. Again, as the BCG study showed, it's like a 25% differential. So we had a lot of challenges with that. Secondly, with the BEAD program expiring, the ISPs have had to do a lot of work explaining to people why they're suddenly getting a bill. Third, they've had to develop their own plans for offering low income, which they want to serve. And in this regard, again, I wish the FCC would make the national verifier available, because the ISPs are very good at a lot of things. They are not good at verifying income. The FCC has something that can do that. That should be made available. But I think the FCC believes it needs authorization from Congress. So that's a very quick thing that you could do to improve it. But it has caused, there's another thing, and I was actually talking to some states about this about a year ago. If ACP goes away, suddenly that provision about affordability, which everyone said not a problem, because we'll just use ACP and it's $30 and it's fine. Suddenly every state had to develop its own program. And as Montana has indicated, their plan has been approved by NTIA. So it's a problem, it takes a lot of work, but we'll get there.
Okay, so thank you. So in a nutshell, it's had a negative impact on the program.
Yes.
Thank you. In your testimony, you also addressed the idea that calling the BEAD affordability provisions, quote, rate regulation is wrong as a matter of law and history. Mr. Levin, could you expand on how common it is that an affordability requirement is included as a condition of receiving a federal subsidy? And also, what are some of the examples? Is this really as out of the ordinary as our friends on the other side of the aisle are making it out to be?
The simple answer is no, it's not out of the ordinary. I know the time's expired. I will simply say my expertise is really with telecommunications and the FCC. Since the 96 Act, which I was involved with, we've had essentially some price constraints when we subsidize essentially a monopoly, but I believe there are similar requirements for grants related to energy, water, and other kinds of things.
Thank you so much. My time having expired, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania's 13th District for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui, for holding such a timely hearing. And thanks to the witnesses for giving your time to testify here today. Mr. Allen, I did appreciate the tower visit with Mr. Gardino in Pennsylvania 13 just a few months ago. And he can tell you about the mountainous topography of my district in Pennsylvania and the cause and effect that that has on deployment of broadband. It's difficult and it can be costly. This is what makes BEAD funding so critical when it can be deployed effectively and in support of rural communities like what I represent in South Central and Southwestern Pennsylvania. Since last December, we have seen firsthand that burdensome standards put forth by NTIA have stood in the way of deploying fast and reliable internet connections to my constituents. Just last month, I sat down with Commissioner Carr in my district to discuss this delayed implementation. And while in Pennsylvania's 13th Congressional District, Commissioner Carr noted how in the 996 days since the BEAD funding was signed into law, not one shovel of dirt has been turned. Not one shovel. From rate regulation and mismatched labor requirements to DEI criteria, the NTIA is making it impossible for states to effectively deploy broadband capabilities. One area that has posed a problem in Pennsylvania is the prevailing wage requirements. The BEAD program's NOFO heavily suggests that payments of prevailing wages and benefits to workers and contractors requires compliance with Davis-Bacon and service contract requirements. However, the mismatch between federal and state prevailing wage structures will result in disproportionate wages compared to actual job requirements, not only causing waste, but pushing out small to mid-sized providers who are best positioned to connect rural households to the broadband services that they so desperately need right now. Ms. Giles, it's interesting how the administration is saying they want internet for all, and yet they're sticking huge labor price tags on these programs. How are states grappling with insurmountable labor costs while trying to ensure all the unserved and the underserved are being developed?
Thank you for the question. So I'll answer more specifically to Montana. We obviously have a pretty good workforce that pays already above prevailing wage in our state. We ran the data and we're already above those numbers. So we struck that balance by making prevailing wage optional. Our companies can get an additional point coming in through the application portal if they want to opt in to full Davis-Bacon. But we did not believe in having a hard, heavy hand on those requirements and requiring it of our companies. So our bigger challenge is the workforce shortage. We're about 3,000 workers short. We're partnering with our youth system, trying to create programs there, and then we have a housing shortage if we can't attract any talent.
Do you feel that allowing those wages to be optional, the stated wages that often interfere, do you feel that allows you to have more bids from more companies, that they can look and see if the requirements are there and if they have the workforce in place to make these bids?
Yes, sir, I do.
Thank you. Ms. Giles, what impacts are the labor requirements having on small providers? And I'm going to ask you, Mr. Alwyn, to answer that question as well.
So our concern is that there is too many requirements on top of each other, right? I mean, you have the cybersecurity, you have workforce, you have low cost, you have all of these nuances in this program that our small providers have not seen in other broadband programs. And so, you know, you're talking about companies that have 6 to 10 personnel. The secretary may be the one ordering the materials, and she's handling all of the operations, and she's making sure the crews go out, and she's also doing all the compliance. And so,
Mr. Alwan, my time is expiring. Are you seeing the same issues?
I think the same issues are there. The small providers are essential, in my opinion. They served a huge purpose in this country, serving the less dense areas, and they're the most experienced. So we need as many of them at the table as we possibly can get. One of the specific things I think we could do that would improve the program is allow for hybrid areas. That is to say, not force any area to have only one technology, but let the provider who's on the ground and knows the topography to provide a hybrid bid. I think that would make a big difference as well.
Ms. Bloomfield, what actions could NTI take today that would alleviate the burden of these prevailing wage requirements on providers?
Well, prevailing wages will be a problem. I won't lie about that. But I do think the making sure that you're matching metro rates to metro builds versus what might be a more relatable rural rate to a rural bid, because otherwise you're going to just have that mismatch in terms of the ability for small providers.
Do you feel that that mismatch allows the rural areas, like where I represent in South Central Pennsylvania, to be underserved? Do you feel that that continues to allow that development to be delayed?
It can be a deterrent, absolutely, and people will factor that into whether or not they can make the economic decision to move forward with the program.
Mr. Chair, my time has expired. Again, I thank all of the witnesses for being present here today, and I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas's 7th District for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to you and Ranking Member Matsui for holding this hearing. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to hear about the implementation and the progress being made in the historic investments from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the BEAD program in particular today. And I really want to thank our witnesses for your time to testify today and also for your work in this really important area. In my home state of Texas, more than 7 million Texans lack access to broadband. And in June of last year, NTIA announced that Texas will receive $3.3 billion in BEAD funding to connect all Texans to broadband. This is the largest allocation of any state, and we know that the proper deployment of all of these funds and resources just takes an incredible amount of time and resources to do right. And I've been glad to be in contact with the folks in Texas who are working on the implementation, who are working closely in the state and with providers and communicating with us about the challenges and the opportunities that this presents for Texans. And certainly we know that there are going to be challenges in implementing something of this scale. And we've talked a little bit about some of them already this morning. But among the challenges, it's clear to me, as someone else said earlier, a consistent issue is really relying on efficient and responsive permitting. And so I appreciated the responses earlier to Mr. Carter's questions about permitting. I am pleased with some of the work that NTIA has done so far to streamline permitting, adding 30 new categorical exclusions for types of projects that don't require a high level of scrutiny. I think that's really important. But as you raised, Ms. Bloomfield, many smaller rural communities just don't have the workforce. I think you've also raised this, Ms. Giles, or the expertise to process the permitting applications and do that sort of quickly and efficiently. So not surprisingly, I introduced a bill on this, the Broadband Incentives for Communities Act, that would help address the issue, giving communities the tools they need through grants to have the resources in place and the training and other assistance that they need. So what I would love is just a little bit more information. Ms. Bloomfield, if you could talk about some of the challenges of deploying broadband in smaller communities that may not have the personnel or tools needed to provide expedited permitting requests. And my proposal was originally kind of a grant program to help enable communities to add staff, to add resources, to be able to do that work. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
That's so vital. And I think not only just to find the bodies to actually understand broadband enough to understand what you're permitting so that you can move pretty quickly. But as each of these agencies come back and think through things like some of the streamlining that we're seeing, that staff then has to actually take that back and implement what those streamlined processes are. So you've also got to have a pretty flexible workforce that understands as new rules are coming down, okay, now we're going to, because this was previously disturbed territory, we're going to be able to move faster here. That's going to be really important. The other thing I would throw out that really is also a really big issue on the ground, not necessarily anything you have control over, but railroad crossings is huge in rural America. When you're talking about deploying broadband in a rural area, and you might be talking about a huge rural county, you might be having to look at a bill that crosses a railroad line 5 or 6 times. That is tens of thousands of dollars. It is months in delay. Things that could be accelerated in terms of broadband deployment. I would also add railroad crossings to the list.
Okay, great. That's helpful. One of the things that we've seen with a lot of the different programs, and there's so many programs that this administration is rolling out from the IIJA, but there has been a real effort to have increased technical assistance available for the applicants and folks who are working on these programs. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on sort of the level of technical assistance and potentially additional assistance that would be needed?
So I think that while it's really helpful from the federal level, what's really happening is you've got 56 states that are doing things a little bit differently. So it's almost more importantly that people have that direct line of communication, that the state offices are having those discussions about the ability to answer those questions because they are run so differently, because they are mapped differently, because they are different size, because they have different technology requirements. That is the dialogue that really is, I think, the most critical, as opposed to having it at the federal agency level.
Okay.
That's where the questions lie right now.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. I'm going to run out of time here, and this is really interesting and really important, obviously, to everyone across the country. So I probably won't have time to get an answer to this question, but Mr. Levin, I just want to direct it to you. Maybe you can provide your response in writing for the record. I just want to highlight that one of the BEAD requirements set out in the statute is that the networks built using the funds be reliable and resilient. And in Houston, where we've got our eyes on the Gulf again this week and watching the storms that are coming our way, we know how important that is. Can you just supplement and talk a little bit about why it's important to plan for reliability and resiliency and the kinds of things that we should be thinking of or enabling, or whether there's any assistance, further assistance that we can provide? I've gone over my time now very quickly, I might add, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Weber. So I will yield back with that, but I thank you all very much for your time and your work.
We'll dock you on the next go-around. The chair now recognizes Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chair Latta for convening this hearing to conduct oversight of the NTIA's administration of the $42.5 billion broadband equity access and deployment program. I would like to start by thanking each of our witnesses for taking time to be with us today, and I'd like to share particular appreciation, which has already been done, to Director Giles. Being here today for your service, but to both the state of Georgia and Governor Perdue's administration and for the nation while at USDA, it's most appreciated for your continued service. And I'd like to congratulate you on the state of Montana becoming the first in the nation to open your BEAD program application portal. One of the things that there are a lot of funding agencies for this. We want to get. I think everybody. It's not a partisan issue. Everybody wants to get broadband, just like we electrified the country years ago. And I was thinking, hey, the best way to do it is block grant the money to the states and let the states do it. Much simpler, because like in the several places in the BEAD program notice of funding opportunity, it expresses preference for a unionized workforce, and of course Georgia is a right to work state, so that doesn't work too well in Georgia. Also talks about paying prevailing wages and providing detailed information regarding a subgrantee's compliance of his contractors and subcontractors, and on. Compliance after compliance, rule after rule. The overwhelming number of ISPs in this country do not have unionized workforces or rely on directly employed personnel. It doesn't make sense for many companies. I'm concerned that NTIA's requirements could deter ISP participation in already difficult labor markets because they are extremely burdensome, administratively difficult, and inefficient. Ms. Bloom, do all of your members directly employ the teams that will do the actual physical deployment of network facilities, or do some of them rely on contractors?
The vast majority of my member companies do rely on contractors, and the ability to plan in advance to get that construction team is probably just as much of a challenge as anything. To your point about prevailing wages, I will say that a combination of supply chain issues, workforce availability, my folks have seen an increased cost in actual construction about 20 to 30% year over year.
Right.
So.
Just out curious, how many of your members have unionized workforces today, or can the unions actually furnish the workers to get the job done?
So I have about 850 community-based companies. We do not track this information, but my best guesstimate is about 75 of those 850 do have union shop, employees within their organization.
And how long have your members been deploying broadband networks in rural
Since it was
areas?
invented.
Okay, all right, great. Director Giles, while I support closing the digital divide that exists in rural America, I'm worried about that adding the 5G fund on top of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the BEAD fund, the Capital Projects Fund, and the Reconnect Fund program will lead to wasted funding instead of connectivity. Like I said, it's coming from every different directions. How are you handling the vast amount of broadband funds that are being thrown at your state?
That's a great question. We do have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, as this is a pretty big problem to solve. I think it really comes down to mapping. I know that was raised several times that mapping is a concern, and it is still a concern, but we're working through the challenge process and with the requirements of NTIA, talking to our providers, trying to get our hands on every single data set we can. I know USDA, to give them a shout out, they've been an incredible partner of keeping us up to date, so we have that data, but it really comes down to adequate mapping, so we can really see where those resources are going.
That's a perfect lead in to my next question. Where are you as far as the maps in, the accurate maps in Montana?
That's a great question. We've had some challenges with getting the new fabric from NTIA, so we are actually operating on 2-year-old fabric. We're still working through that process with our challenge results. We're hoping that we can clean this up on the backside after we get the grant proposals in, but most states are actually operating on August 2022 fabric due to the delays between the FCC, NTIA, and the states of getting that data.
So we got the cart before the horse here?
Yes, sir. A little bit.
And so here we are, yeah, federal programs, yeah. So anyway, thank you. I yield back, and thank you for your being here today and trying to help us get this done.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan for at least 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Expanding strong broadband internet access is critical for modernizing our country's infrastructure, and we must ensure that connectivity reaches communities that need it the most. The Biden-Harris administration's $42 billion investment in the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, BEAD, as we're all calling it, brings high-speed internet access to rural and underserved areas by funding broadband planning, infrastructure deployment, and adoption programs in all 50 states and U.S. territories. At the same time, we need to ensure that internet service is not only available, but affordable to all Americans. And that's something I'm going to fight for, and I know many of my colleagues are every day. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that many families are disadvantaged without reliable internet access at home, preventing them from participating in school, telehealth, and other services that just too many of us take for granted. Ensuring that all households have equal access to online resources and opportunities is a top priority. We have worked hard on this committee to deliver billions of dollars to expand access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet to underserved and underserved households. Last month, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration approved Michigan's initial proposals for the BEAD program, enabling my state to access funding and begin implementation. It's a significant step towards closing the digital divide and providing every household with affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. But I want to ensure that Michigan fully leverages this investment to address affordability, digital skills, and access to devices, which are all essential steps towards achieving digital equality. However, the BEAD program has faced criticism recently for not moving quickly enough. And I understand the frustration of those underserved and underserved communities who are waiting for that connectivity. But it's important for my Republican colleagues, all of whom voted against this program while taking credit for it, to remember that the bipartisan infrastructure law clearly outlines a timeline for implementing the BEAD program. It involves substantial efforts, including in some cases creating and staffing state broadband offices, engaging with stakeholders and the public, developing a comprehensive 5-year action plan, establishing the BEAD challenge process, and designing a robust subgrantee selection framework, among other activities. These steps take time if they're going to be done right. Congress set an ambitious goal for BEAD, 100% availability of high-speed internet. Achieving this goal is got to be thorough and intentional. So, Mr. Levin, given the scale and the complexity of the BEAD program, are you surprised at where we are now in terms of the BEAD program timeline?
No, but if I could offer a personal note for a second, I had the honor of working with your late husband in both the development and the implementation of the 1996 Telecom Act. He was quite a critic of some of the things we did, but he was a model of criticism in terms of being clear and very focused on what can you do better. And I just wanted to say I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
So no, the timeline, it's you know, arguably taking a little bit longer than I might have thought back in 2021, but it's roughly on target. And again, I think that the reason, and you've laid out a number of things that need to be done, is because Congress was reacting to the disastrous 2020 RDOF auction. And I think it was appropriate to look at that and continually learn. That is the purpose of congressional oversight.
Thank you. As many of you know, affordability will continue to go hand in hand with the BEAD program. We don't want to invest these funds to build these networks just for folks not to be able to afford to connect to them. And because of that, it's crucial to find a balance between making sure BEAD-funded networks are sustainable and keeping connections affordable to all Americans. Mr. Levin, as an outside observer, what have you seen states do to achieve this balance?
Well, a lot of states have done it in different ways, and I would just point out, it's interesting to me that there's been criticism of both the price and the labor requirements in BEAD, but Montana has gotten through it, and I think that's an example of what you need to do. So states are going to look at this differently. If the ACP had been extended, I think the states would have had a fairly uniform way of doing it. But I don't want to question any particular state. The governors are in a great position to understand what needs to be done. And if I can, I know we're over time, but COVID, which you mentioned, was the best evangelist ever for universal broadband, far better than the executive director of the National Broadband Plan, because it demonstrated the different ways in which constituents needed the service. Governors are in a great position to understand how to address the trade-offs.
Thank you. I'm out of time, Mr. Chair, so I'll yield back and submit some questions for the record. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the panel for being here. Appreciate your input. This is a huge issue for my home state of Idaho. And I had a question to start for Ms. Bloomfield. You mentioned in your testimony the need for scalable technology deployment as a way to be more cost effective. And that caught my attention. In Idaho, we've got a tremendous amount of federal lands, 33 million acres. That's M for a million. And quite frankly, they just go unmanaged. There's not the resources to manage them. Forest Service, BLM's overwhelmed from that standpoint. And if they do get a project for management, they get sued. And next thing you know, you got somewhere between 300 to 400,000 acres on fire right now, which is what we've got. And so when you said scalable technology deployment, that kind of at least caught my eye. Could you look at that and expand on that through the lens of a scenario that I'm framed for Idaho, where you got you're trying to manage with these challenges, keeping fire roads, trails clear when the infrastructure challenge is so high. Could you just expand on your thoughts there?
So I will share that I appreciate the question, that when I think about scalable networks, I really think about how we make sure that we use this time, this opportunity, and this historic moment to really build future-proof networks. I look at folks in Idaho and I think, we shouldn't be making people who live in a rural state or rural area second-class citizens. And at the end of the day, you have to measure the value of the network over the life of the network, particularly when we're using taxpayer resources, which is why I am very bullish about a fiber preference, because I think that is the way to make sure that we are doing a sustainable investment. You do have unique challenges with, as we go back to permitting, in the state of Idaho with Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service and all of those things that really do also slow down these projects. But you also have some incredibly remote areas, which is, again, that even though I will say fiber first, that looking at that toolkit, that making sure that you've got the opportunity to build to that person who lives on the mountaintop or across the river. I think we've got to be adaptable with technology to make sure that we actually are able to connect all Americans, because, again, your state will have some unique resource challenges. But if we can get Bureau of Land Management and some of those permitting moving quicker, I think you're going to see deployment moving even faster in some of those western states.
Desperately needs to happen. I'm going to play off of that, and I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I go to Ms. Giles first. And so that's a discussion on the infrastructure component. I want to talk timeline for a minute here. As I just referred to, we've got somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 acres on fire in my neighboring state. You're familiar with those types of challenges, Ms. Giles. Can you, and then I ask Ms. Bloomfield the same question, can either of you provide any ideas regarding timeline, reforms that maybe we can put in place to help on infrastructure for local broadband companies to get relief on the timeline for the BEAD implementation? Ms. Giles?
Thank you for the question. I think a couple things we've already discussed a little bit today is permitting is key, making sure we have that resolved. Do not have states be mandated to use the NTIA system that will not even be ready for 6 to 8 months. That's going to slow up states like Montana and others that are a little bit ahead of the curve. I think also shedding some sunlight on what is the timeline for the final proposal. We don't have that template yet. We don't know if it's going to take another 6, 8, 9 months once we submit to get approval. That'll cost a lot of us western states to lose another construction season. I think as it looks with this alternative technology, we need that guidance to be fleshed out further. The Undersecretary is still the ultimate arbitrator of what types of technology you use. That makes my state a little nervous, given that we have some unique challenges, much like your state. So I think those are kind of 3 big rocks that would alleviate a lot of the pain if we can just get some sunlight on some of these things and see what is the end of the tunnel.
Ms. Bloomfield, I'm going to come back to you. I think I know where you might be going when you mentioned permitting and how that stretches out, but I'd like to get your answer anyway.
Well, I will also add that my companies have been building 24/7. Again, post-COVID, and when everybody realized how important broadband was. So they are not waiting for BEAD. So they are already doing a lot of construction projects at this point in time. So I would say that, if we can streamline and get mapping to be more accurate, if we can be thinking about access to supplies, I worry about 2025 when BEAD really opens up and everybody is searching for fiber across the country, just like we did during 2020. That is a concern to me. Labor, workforce, all of those types of things, I think, are all going to impact the timeline as we've got construction going.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I've got about 10 minutes more questions, but I don't think you're going to give it to me. So
The gentleman is correct.
Yeah.
The gentleman yield back?
Gentleman yield, sorry.
Okay. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois for at least 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing today, and thank you to all the witnesses. As a member who represents a district that is urban, suburban, and rural, I know the importance and continued need to ensure that all Americans have access to high-speed, reliable, and affordable internet services so that they can participate in our modern society. There is no denying that closing the digital divide in denser, more urban parts of my district outside of Chicago is just as important as doing so in more rural parts closer to Fairbury, and some of my areas have nothing. Having access to affordable high-speed internet is critical, as you know. However, access only matters so much if my constituents cannot afford it. The bipartisan members who passed the infrastructure law had the good sense to not only create the historic Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, but also to include a separate affordability requirement within the BEAD program. Responsibility was given to each state to determine its own low-cost figure, subject to approval or disapproval by the NTIA. Mr. Levin, these affordability measures are essential to the success of the BEAD program as they help to ensure there are customers willing and able to get connected. May you please explain why affordability is necessary for success of the BEAD program and our bipartisan goal of universal connectivity?
Well, in the infrastructure bill, Congress found that access to broadband was essential to participating in the economy and in society, and which, by the way, we did in 2010 in the National Broadband Plan. But COVID made that very, very clear. So to achieve that goal, you have to have both the access, the networks, and the affordability component. But they work together because, as I've mentioned earlier, if you have an affordability program where you're subsidizing low-income folks, that makes the building, the access component, much more affordable to Shirley's members and to others. And so that's how they work together. I might also add, and we haven't talked about it here, it also, for example, I think reduces the cost of Medicaid, because one of the things COVID taught us is that increasingly we're offering services in healthcare over communications networks, and the same is true for job training and job searching and education in other ways. So it really is a virtuous cycle, but if you take one piece out of it, the affordability piece, you cause the whole system to become much more expensive.
Well, it's funny you mentioned workforce, because I was going to go give you a chance to address the workforce and supply chain issues that you noted would play a determining role in the fate of BEAD. But I will say I do a lot of healthcare work, and a lot of my doctors said their patients did not miss appointments because of being able to, go online, and that was across the United States, because I worked with a lot of doctors during the COVID period. But I'll give you a chance to talk about workforce and supply chain issues.
Yeah, I think those are critical issues, and I want to say if you're going to hold another hearing on permitting, throw in workforce and supply chain. I might note, look, there have been concerns about the price constraints and the labor things, but as Montana has illustrated, those have been worked out with NTIA. My fellow panelist from Montana, when asked about what were her biggest problems, I saw an article in which she said geography, workforce, and supply chain. And I think those are actually the biggest problems, and they're across the state. I might note that the Commerce Department did a very good job of bringing more supply chain by America into the United States. They work with Nokia and others, and I think largely successful. But part of what's happening is that the private sector in about 2017 started the AT&T and Verizon and Frontier and other telcos who had previously thought the FiOS experiment was bad for business, suddenly said, oh my God, we've got to shift. We're losing too many DSL customers. We're going to shift to fiber. And so you not just have the public buying more fiber, you also have the private sector buying more fiber. So I think those are all very, very significant things, and I would really urge you to hold hearings on all three of those. If I can add one more thing on permitting, I think this is consistent with what my fellow panelist has said. Rural America doesn't put up a lot of obstacles to building things. That's really an urban phenomenon, with all due respect. But what urban America lacks are some of the tools, particularly software tools, and I think that's an incredibly important part of the permitting process, making sure that rural folks, those small areas, have access to software which can solve a lot of these problems more quickly.
Thank you. I had a question for you, Mr. Allman, about fiber, but I'm respecting my time, so I'll submit it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's topic is certainly timely. I frequently hear from my constituents who ask me why they haven't been connected to high-speed internet yet. And I have testimony from a constituent who lives in one of our harder-to-reach counties, and I'll get to that in a minute. But my district borders Georgia and Alabama in the north, the Gulf of Mexico in the south, and everything in between is pretty much agricultural, rural, and remote. My constituents many of them live in hard-to-serve areas that are receiving flyers in the mail that says internet service providers are advertising high-speed internet connectivity, and they call them regarding the offer, and they say, oh, not you. You can't get connected in your location, no matter what you want to pay, right? So this illustrates how complex the broadband ecosystem really is between the big ISPs, rural co-ops, cables, companies, and the really hard to service areas just don't get built out on a priority basis. And the truth is, connecting underserved areas is extremely difficult, and it's not economically viable. So I think we're finding out through the BEAD process that a one-size-fits-all approach of just build fiber everywhere is not the right answer for everyone. We're 4 years into the program. Implementation in Florida is still quite far behind, quite honestly. Mr. Allen. You mentioned in your testimony how technology is always advancing, and your company, Tirana Wireless, serves customers as far as 22 miles away. I think, there's alternative technologies, the low Earth orbit satellite broadband services, which we all know are coming and are growing daily. And not just one, there's several. I think that must be part of the solution to connect 100% of our remote areas, in a lot of my remote areas. NTI recently revised their requirements around using alternative technologies in certain high-cost areas. And I wonder, do you believe NTI has done enough to make sure that the states and the people know that they can use and sponsor these alternative technologies? And has NTI provided any support to the states or the people to navigate the programs so they can understand that?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, never enough, because things have changed pretty dramatically.
Little closer to your mic or turn it on if it's not.
It's on, but maybe I can lean in a little bit. Yeah, okay. To your question, thank you for the question. Never enough. We have a long way to go here. Technology has really advanced, and even today, people still believe fiber in many cases is the only answer. It brings up permitting, workforce issues, but wireless has actually come a long way to the point where it can be a legitimate, not only legitimate, but a peer way to offer broadband. And we need to take advantage of that. It's super important. In fact, my view is I'm somewhat comforted by the fact that I think economics will rule the day. In other words, in the end, we will not be able to get 100% coverage unless we take pretty good advantage of these technologies.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I'm a big fan of it. I actually own one of those ground-based stations, and I could use it to compete against my home, which has got, is wired as well, but it works just fine. I do live video feeds to Ukraine constantly. I mean, it's pretty easy. So, Mr. Bloomfield, we're seeing different problems with BEAD program, like implementation delays, build-out requirements that act as social programs instead of internet service requirements and providing high-speed broadband. So things about regulating rates, labor requirements, buy and build America and whatnot. In your opinion, have we been really streamlining this process, or are we making it more difficult?
I think anytime you add additional requirements or burdens, it's going to slow things down. It's going to make it more difficult. People are going to think through the different hoops before they're willing to go through them. However, I would say I do find NTIA has been actually very accommodating, at least willing to discuss some of these issues. And when we've really hit a wall on certain things, like the Buy America provision, Part 200, we saw a definite movement on their part.
Thank you. So there's also a thing called the RDOF, the Rural Development, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and separate from BEAD. And I have a feeling that the states don't always know that they can access both of those. And can you speak to, how these multiple programs, broadbands, again, Ms. Bloomfield, and what do you think the solution is for states and remote areas that are having problems?
So I think the key is coordination, because to your point, there are numerous programs. So the RDOF program is run by the FCC. USDA has Reconnect and the loan programs over there. NTIA with BEAD, Treasury with capital funds. You've got a lot of different entities, and that is why I think all roads eventually go back to mapping. We've got to make sure they're coordinated. We've got to make sure that we're not overbuilding. We've got scarce resources, and we need to make sure we use them most efficiently.
Well, my constituents would be most grateful for all of these programs, and I thank you very much for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California for at least 5 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for holding this very important hearing. I have served on this subcommittee for 30 years. 30 years. So I have seen innovation just dance over all of these decades. And the advancements, of course, are to the benefit of the American people. And so I'm so pleased that that the subcommittee is having this hearing, because it's so important to do oversight, to see how the decisions we have made are advancing. We have made a huge investment, recognizing that broadband is one of the most important undertakings in our nation for the future of everyone in our country. Everyone was impacted by the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. But were it not for the technologies that we had, we simply would not have functioned, as difficult as it was. But at least we could communicate with one another, and the platforms that have been established. So, you know, the votes for these programs, you know, the Democrats stepped up. They really stepped up. I'm not here to bash anyone, but I will note that we were the only ones that voted for it. For 30 years, Republicans and Democrats on this subcommittee wringing our hands over getting broadband to everyone in our country, and that it has to be affordable. If it's not affordable, then it simply doesn't exist. So with the BEAD program today, it's very sad to me that the appropriation for it has been allowed to lapse. That is the responsibility of the majority. And, you know, over 40% of the families that receive these great rates are military families in our country. So really, shame on us. Shame on us. I hear from constituents, you know, querying constantly what's happening with this because we have used it and it has been so important to them. There's been a discussion here about, and legitimately, relative to resilience and reliability, and that, you know, fixed wireless fixed wireless is unreliable, and the questions that have been asked of Mr. Alwan. I'm proud of what you have accomplished and what you continue to do. I find it very exciting. But I think it's very important to note that the NTA listened very hard. Listened very hard. Mr. Alwan and anyone else that is in a related technology, part of the industry, have been taken seriously by the NTIA and Alan, who heads it up. Would you like to would you maybe tell us a very short story of, I know where you started, but I think it's important for the record, for the committee's record, to know how the presentation was made, who came to meet with you, and that, because, you know, I mean, it's said that, you know, the federal agencies are so far away from people, they don't know who they are, you can't get a phone call in, you can't get a meeting with them. It's a different story for Toronto. Would you tell us, enlighten the rest of the committee, Mr. Alwan, on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, for sure. I mean, I do want to comment that the NTA has been engaging us really well, and the framework of the law was a very fiber-first law when it first came out.
Yes, it's a preference of the administration.
It's a preference,
I
and truth be
understand that.
told,
No.
at the time it was put together, that was appropriate. Technology has just advanced so much, and what I do appreciate is our engagement with the NTIA and their openness to reevaluate and kind of put out new guidelines, which they have done. It's never fast enough, as I mentioned, because, you know, things are happening right now, and I think the equation, closing that equation, is going to be so difficult. But we've had a constant good interaction with the NTIA. There's been a lot of good feedback. I think it's been a good two-way engagement.
How does next generation fixed wireless address the issue of reliability and resilience?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's interesting. Fiber is certainly great, but fiber is not just fiber. Sometimes aerial fiber has real issues with reliability as well. The nice thing about fixed wireless or wireless in general is the medium is non-existent. It's air. There's no issue with crossing railroad tracks. You don't need a permit for that. So it actually is in fact, we're finding in some countries a strong preference for wireless over fiber in places where trenching happens kind of randomly and where there's not an opportunity to control things. So I think wireless has gotten to the point, and a big part of this is the technology we put together for managing spectrum, where it can be very reliable, very much like a wireline network, and very, very high speed.
The gentlelady's at least 5 minutes has expired.
I know. Thank you,
The
Mr.
chair now
Chairman.
recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee for
apologize.
at least 5 minutes.
Right.
All good.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the panel for being here today. You know, an entry-level economics class could explain why price controls at a grocery store would lead to food shortages, but it's less obvious how something like broadband could be impacted by price controls. So my question is to you, Ms. Bloomfield, what harm could come from a price control on broadband, and how would that affect people in my district, rural East Tennesseans or other rural communities having their networks built by the BEAD program be hurt by a price cap on broadband, which on the surface sounds like a great deal?
I appreciate the question greatly. So I do think that, you know, the important thing has been allowing some of the states to really be able to determine using data and quantifiable analysis in terms of what rates make the most sense for their states. So I think that flexibility is really important. Obviously, not all states adhere to that. You know, I look at the state of New York mandating $15. That's going to make it very difficult to bring any provider to the table. However, I would say that the unsung hero, you know, in terms of affordability and things to be pondering on that, really is the Universal Service Program. Because if that program goes away, rural rates will go up to probably about, you know, our latest survey shows about $163 a month for rural consumers. We start weighing some of that, then, you know, whether or not you build the network become irrelevant because people won't be able to afford it.
That's terrible, $163 a month. Mr. Alwyn, my constituents are just the type you describe in your testimony. My district's very rural. Many homes are nestled away in the mountains, a lot of them in the Great Smoky Mountains, beyond the sight line of the nearest tower. So how does Tarana utilize spectrum to deliver high-quality internet beyond the sightlines of its towers, and why should taxpayer dollars from the BEAD program go towards your technology?
Yeah, it's one of the great things I've experienced in my career in Silicon Valley is that things that weren't possible all of a sudden become possible with another turn of the crank, and this is one of those moments. And specifically the way we do it is quite technical, but you can think of it as we are able to, in the digital domain, reconstruct signals of reflections and refractions, and actually reconstruct a signal even though it's bouncing off of all kinds of things in real time. It's a quite interesting mathematics trick, but what it results in is a non-line of sight, very high reliability signal at very high speeds. And we're seeing that the demonstrations we've done, including with Ms. Eshu and around the country, have really proven out that we can do non-line of sight, even through trees, at very high speeds. And the impact of that is the issue. In a lower density area, that's economics. That's economics. That means you can offer it to more people a great service.
Okay. Well, I think that's it, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida for at least, that's what I've been doing, Kat. Where have you been? Yeah. For yeah, the preceding comment was an editorial statement, not necessarily reflecting the views of the management. The chair recognizes the lady from Florida for at least 5 minutes.
Shit. All right, my microphone's not working. I'll leave it. Is it working?
It's working.
Okay, the light's not working. All right, well, at least one of those is on the record. All right, thank y'all. Sorry about the confusion today. We are running back and forth, lots of things happening at the same time. So, jumping into BEAD. Of all the states' plans NTIA has approved so far, each has identified a specific price or range of prices. Many of the states that have yet to be approved by NTIA, including Florida, my home state, have thus declined to do so, resisting NTIA's pressure campaign to get states to regulate broadband rates in direct conflict with the infrastructure's law text. Now, not only does this rely on questionable legal authority and longstanding commitment to not regulating broadband rates, but it's also bad policy. I would like to enter into the record South Carolina's Cured Volume 2 proposal, which was, quote, without the establishment of an approved low-cost broadband service option, the NTIA will not open to the state of South Carolina its additional allocation of $546,535,983.05.
Without objection.
In BEAD funds. Thank you. Director Giles, Montana was able to get approval from NTIA, albeit at a higher price than other states. Did NTIA make clear to you that it would only approve a plan that included an identified price for the low-cost plan?
Yes.
Okay. With the low-cost plan Montana has selected, how long is the provider responsible for providing that rate? And are they able to raise the rate to account for inflation? And additionally, what guidance has NTIA given in regards to the future of the low-cost requirement? So 3 parts.
Thank you. That's a great question. So to the guidance piece specifically, let's walk that back. So the requirement first and foremost is for 10 years as it relates to inflation. Yes and no. Some plans have been approved that have inflationary increases. It's unclear as to whether that will be allowed or not. Obviously, companies are pushing for that certainty. 10 years is a long time. The data that we use is updated every single year, but still think we would like to have some clarity in that. So I hate to give an unclear answer, but the guidance is unclear, so we're still kind of waiting to see how that shakes out in different states.
I have yet to meet a witness who says that they don't like an unclear answer. They love unclear answers. All right, so now we've talked about the delays that Montana and many other states may be facing if NTIA continues to offer guidance that conflicts with previous requirements. One thing that we haven't talked about is the impact that you perceive this delay will have on providers in Montana. So, Dr. Giles, how do the delays impact Montana's ISPs and stakeholders? And what happens to the BEAD timeline if Montana loses the 2025 build construction season?
Thank you. That's a great question. I know we've talked a lot about timelines, and I think it's all important to realize that this law was enacted in 2021, and at best right now we'll have fiber in the ground in 2029. So that's 8 years out that Americans are without these services, be it fixed wireless, fiber in the ground, or low Earth satellite. For Montana specifically, we're hoping to get our final proposal in by early spring. I think a big thing that we're unclear on is how long that will take to get approval. Because obviously if we miss a 2025 construction season, that's another year for us that we have to delay. We only get May through maybe October at best. That's in a good year. So I think for the western states, it's pretty critical to ensure that those approvals are very fast. Otherwise, we're going to lose another year, and we're into now 2030 of looking at connecting Americans.
Now, Mr. Alwan, I'm going to jump to you. Can you discuss the process for receiving NTIA's approval of your technology? Very briefly.
Yeah, there's no formal process for approving the technology. We fit into what's called non-priority and alternative. So after fiber, it's automatic. If fiber is not available at the correct price point, we would be approved for use.
Do you like it that way?
I think if we were to do that bill now, we would put fiber and next-gen fixed wireless on the same footing. I don't think there's a reason to have a priority or anymore. At the time, there may have been. Times have changed.
Okay, something to consider. Ms. Bloomfield, we have seen some of the shortcomings, and you highlighted them in your testimony, including inadequate vetting of bidders until after the end of the reverse auction. So to the point that so much of the FCC has provided amnesty to art off some winners. There's some in my state that have fallen through. What are some of the lessons learned that BEAD should implement from those situations?
That is a great question, and I think that is where some of the frustration comes with how this is taking so much time. The difference is this is vetting up front, because the last thing any one of us wants to do is in 5 years be in front of you and tell you why this didn't work. So I think that is the beauty, because you've got constituents who thought they were going to get broadband 3 years ago, and then their provider called uncle because they couldn't meet the RDOF requirements.
Yep.
So I do think there have been some lessons learned, and I'd like to think we're implementing them.
And would you agree that the census tract model, it's a flawed one?
Oh, the smaller the better in terms of service territories in my book.
Absolutely. And I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, or I'm over my time, but I'm filibustering for my gentleman and colleague in the 2 floors down from the great state of Texas. So give me some leeway here, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. So in talking about the census element being so broken, right? What about the crowdfunding of maps?
Oh, so, I think the more data you can get into the map system, the better. And I think, there should be more verification on the ground. I mean, I'm a big fan of, go out there, see it, because right now, all a provider has to do is do advertised rates. They don't actually have to be able to provide it.
Okay, we're going to have to end there. I apologize. So I was enjoying your soliloquy. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Landslide Miller Meeks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and also Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui for holding this hearing today. I also want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee. In Iowa, our household, businesses, farmers, and healthcare providers rely on affordable, secure, accessible internet service. The BEAD program has the potential to make significant progress towards closing the digital divide for rural states such as Iowa. However, we are soon approaching 3 years since the program was created without a single home connected yet. Now, if we had more and better connectivity, more Iowans could watch Caitlin Clark break records in the WNBA on her way to Rookie of the Year. So, Ms. Bloomfield, the NTIA's push to require states to set prices for broadband service through the BEAD program has come up a number of times. When it comes to the requirement in the IIJA for a low-cost broadband service option, what is NCTA's recommendation for how states should establish such a plan so that it also complies with the IIJA's mandate against rate regulation?
So as somebody who has 30 of my community-based providers in your congressional district, you know well how important this is. And I will also say Iowa is an example of a really well-done state program. So a number of my companies out in your state have been building thanks to what the state has had the foresight to do even before BEAD rolled out. In terms of the low-cost option, again, I think it all goes back to really doing some analysis on the ground in terms of what is affordability, not just taking a number and plugging it in. And I think, again, some states, including Montana, Virginia, and some others have done a very, very nice job on that. Again, I'm going to go back to the fact, particularly in a state like Iowa, universal service, high-cost funding, that is what is keeping the rates reasonable for your folks and for the ability to roll out initiatives like Smart Ag out there. So I keep that in mind on a parallel track.
And can you also explain the complications and impacts on provider of mandating an arbitrarily low price that is untethered to market forces?
It'll make it very difficult for smaller providers who are already struggling to make a business case to build to a very high cost, unserved area, to actually make that business case to do so. So you might have some providers who will walk.
What requirements in state BEAD plans, since we were mentioning Iowa's program, might prevent your members from participating and therefore affect how much competition states see in their BEAD programs?
I think the more regulations, the more requirements that get piled on, I think the more difficult it becomes. So I think getting the states to put out their guidance as soon as possible so that providers can actually evaluate whether or not they're going to make the investment.
In the midst of a national effort to deliver internet for all, FCC has chosen to saddle the industry with 2 sets of unnecessary rules that will only make the effort more difficult. The FCC has rightly been taken to court after its decision to impose Title II utility-style regulations on broadband and to create an open-ended digital discrimination regime that diverges significantly with congressional intent. Your members have expressed that Title II reclassification threatens substantial burdens for your small providers. If the FCC's rules are allowed to stand, does that change the economics for your members' ability to participate in BEAD?
I will be honest with you, my members are already fairly regulated because of the Universal Service Program, so they are probably more concerned about digital discrimination than they are about net neutrality.
Director Giles, in your testimony, you stated that the cost of the deployment combined with a 4-year implementation period will strain Montana's ability to implement the program. You also noted that due to long winters, providers in Montana and comparable states such as Iowa, will be lucky to have half of that time to deploy their networks. Can you explain how the lack of proactive guidance from NTIA has exacerbated this issue and others when it comes to implementation?
Thank you for the question. As stated in my testimony, all the western states are going to have half the time of the 4-year period to implement these funds. So I think getting ahead of the curve, and so the companies, to the points made earlier, can have those expectations, know what they're up against, buy their materials, would be helpful to just ground the program in some practicality of just sheer differences in weather. We can't change that. I mean, that's just a uniqueness we all have. So sooner the better, though. Our companies are all asking, if I do receive funding, will I have 4 years? Because that's not plausible.
Can you explain the delay from December 2023 briefly until last month before NTIA approved your plan?
We went through several rounds of curing, most of which was not substantive, and then it was pretty much dark for about 4 months, just waiting for crickets to gain approval. That's a very short summary.
Thank you very much, and thank you, and I yield, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman I recognize, the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity for this hearing. I just came from another hearing where we were talking about the Chinese Communist Party and how we're competing against them. I know that the subject of this hearing is not rip and replace, but I would urge that the committee take strong and immediate action when it comes to competing with China and the malign activities that they have, and commit to fully funding the rip and replace program during the remainder of this particular year, this fiscal year, so that we can not only compete with the Chinese Communist Party, but know what our network is doing and the issues that we have technologically. A 2023 GAO report identified 133 broadband supporting programs across 15 different federal agencies. Both the GAO and Commissioner Carr have recommended a national broadband strategy to help synchronize these efforts. Billions of dollars have been spent, and I think it's critical that we do exactly that. Director Giles, I'll start with you. In a previous role, you served as Chief of Staff for the Rural Development at USDA, which you mentioned in your testimony, which included administering the Reconnect program, one of the previously mentioned broadband supporting programs. I represent a very rural area in Texas, 317 miles east to west, and as Chief Operating Officer for Montana, in charge of coordinating the multitude of broadband funding opportunities for your state. How has your office deconflicted the broadband awards?
So we've been working through our mapping process. I think our biggest challenge is having access to most accurate data. Most states are actually operating on August 22 fabric. So we're already 2 years behind the jump. There's a lot of delays between getting the FCC data down to the NTIA, down to the states. That's just a lot of hoops and hurdles. So, but mapping is key. We've been trying to partner with our federal partners. USDA has been a fantastic partner. Granted, I have a little bit of home turf advantage with those folks. And then just trying to navigate all the different moving parts and talking to the companies to make sure if they are doing private build, we have that data pretty quickly. But it really comes down to how accurate is your map.
So the lack of a strategy, the inaccuracy of the maps, the overlapping 15 agencies, all these programs, I mean, how ripe is this for fraud, waste, and abuse?
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's a risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. I think there's a risk of, without getting the mapping efforts correct, that we could overbuild in areas, and then we're already seeing this with some of my ARPA projects specifically. We have to go back, and then we have to deconflict. Those companies already made plans, so it's creating more rigmarole and bureaucracy, both for the state and the provider, and uncertainty. So I think we just need to make sure our data is accurate and we have all of that, and then all the agencies be better about coordinating internally up at the federal level.
I think we're seeing the same, but also there is a very plausible scenario where fraud, waste, and abuse can happen, and especially in some urban areas as well. I'll get into the mapping side of it. Some ISPs have expressed ongoing challenges in reconciling the data. You've kind of alluded to this. And for some providers, despite participating in the biannual efforts for data collection as a process, that the serviceable locations are still missing from the maps as locations. Many of you are nodding your heads. I'll go with Ms. Bloomfield. How are the FCC and NTIA working with states and providers to ensure that these maps are as accurate as possible before those BEAD dollars are deployed?
I would put this on the list of another hearing that you all could do, could be about mapping. Honestly, mapping is just the fundamental basis for everything that we are talking about today. And so I am still seeing some of my folks, getting told that, bales of hay or big rocks in the field are a serviceable location. I have a company in Montana that has a ghost.
The act would require that broadband supporting agencies use the updated map and request non-mandatory reports. I'd like to enter 2 letters into the record in support of the Protocol Act from the Taxpayer Protection Alliance and America's Communications Association.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thanks.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate Chair Latta and Ranking Member Matsui convening this hearing, and thank you both to our witnesses also for being here to share their experiences and expertise. Expanding broadband access to underserved and unserved areas has been a cornerstone of my work in Congress. In today's digital age, access to high-speed internet is indeed essential. It impacts students, job seekers, healthcare services, and entrepreneurs alike. The bipartisan infrastructure law is a landmark investment in our broadband infrastructure, allocating some $42 billion to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment BEAD program. This represents the largest effort in American history to ensure every household has access to reliable, affordable, and high-speed internet. Just last month, I was proud to see New York's initial proposal for the BEAD program approved by NTIA, unlocking over $664 million to expand broadband to underserved communities across my state. This is not just about connecting homes. It's about connecting people to opportunities. I'm especially proud of how this funding is being effectively managed, thanks to the work of the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, which I championed through my Access Broadband Act in 2020. So, Mr. Levin, the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth has played a pivotal role in managing federal broadband spending, engaging with communities, and facilitating coordination amongst federal and state agencies. Given the complexity of the BEAD program's mission to close the digital divide, how is the office's coordinating role critical to ensuring that funding is efficiently and effectively allocated, and what specific actions can the office take to further streamline the program's implementation and address ongoing challenges in the underserved communities?
Thank you for your question. I think it plays a very critical role. As has been discussed throughout this hearing, there are a number of different federal programs. I look at it from the perspective of if I was a mayor or a governor and I saw a gap in our situation, how would I know what program to appeal to? And so, for example, in the application forms, there ought to be some kind of standardization. There ought to be some kind of coordination. One thing we really haven't talked about is, we've talked about the accessibility, that's really a capital issue. We've talked about affordability, that's really an operating expense issue. But there's also about training, there's inclusion, there are a number of other things that we found that to really achieve the goal of making sure that we have networks everywhere and everybody on it, and we're improving the way we deliver essential services by using broadband, you have to have a better coordinated federal effort. And I think that office is very important for that.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Levin, as you also mentioned in your testimony, the BEAD program includes provisions to ensure that federally funded broadband services are affordable for the most vulnerable.
Yep.
It's very important that those provisions not be watered down, particularly with the expiration of the separate but related Affordable Connectivity Program. So my office alone has heard from well over 3,000 constituents about concerns over allowing the ACP to expire. What steps should Congress take to address this issue, especially to ensure BEAD funds continue to be effective in connecting low-income communities? And we heard that from Chair Eshoo earlier.
Yeah. In the short term, I think it would be non-controversial to clearly authorize the FCC to allow the national verifier to be used by the ISPs, many of whom have low-income programs, but don't want to be in the business of verifying incomes. But that's just a short-term solution. The longer-term solution is to essentially fold the Affordable Connectivity Program into the Universal Service Program, but also make sure that the Universal Service Program is economically viable. The most recent report from the Universal Service Administrative Corporation demonstrates the contribution base is as low as ever, and the contribution factor, therefore, is as high as ever. That's not economically viable in the long term. And then you have the problem of the Fifth Circuit case ruling the whole system unconstitutional. I know there's an effort, bipartisan effort. We can't wait that much longer. We really need to fix this problem.
Thank you. Well, I see I only have about a half a minute left, so Ms. Bloomfield, I'm going to send your way a question concerning mapping, which I share as a representative of the Capital Region of New York State. I appreciate the comments made today about mapping, and with that, I'll yield back so that the, I will yield to.
I just want to set something down for the record. There's been many references to rate regulation. I think we all have to remember that we have put up, the Congress has put up a ton of federal money into a program. Democrats, I think we all believe, but we always, it's a first for us to have affordable rates. And you can't just, companies can't just take the federal money and then charge people whatever they want to charge. So some may call that rate regulation. I call it affordability.
Does the gentlelady have a request for unanimous consent?
Well, I did, but I understand, Mr. Chairman, you're very kind, that that this letter has already been placed in the record.
Then the gentlelady's time has expired.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
All right.
Thank you.
I appreciate you yielding that negative amount back. Seeing there are no further members wishing to be recognized, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be in order. We are finished. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, staff. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Tuesday, September 24th, and now that objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.